Tonight we begin with something a little darker, a time of plagues, punishments, and pottage. We're diving into what life was really like during the Middle Ages. Forget the castles and chivalry Hollywood sold you. The truth? You probably wouldn't last a single day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1325. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the fleas. Your bed is a half-rotted straw mattress stuffed with bugs and hay that smells like a barn floor, because it was a barn floor 3 months ago. There's no memory foam, no pillows, and definitely no Egyptian cotton sheets. Just a wool blanket that hasn't been washed since last winter, and now weighs roughly as much as a small cow from the accumulated grime. You blink awake as the church bell clangs in the distance. It's the medieval version of an alarm clock, only louder, and somehow even less merciful. Your home is a wooden hut with one room, no windows, and a charming open-concept floor plan where your family, livestock, and domestic insects all share the same space. The smell. Oh, it's a fragrant symphony. A subtle blend of stale beer, human sweat, goat, and something you pray isn't mold, but know in your soul probably is. Scented candles haven't been invented, and even if they were, they just melt on your dirt floor. You try to stretch, but immediately regret it because the air is freezing and your joints ache. You're 22 years old, which in medieval terms is roughly middle-aged. Your spine creaks like an old wooden door, and your knees sound like a bag of rocks being shaken by a confused peasant. Getting out of bed is a gamble. The floor is either wet from last night's rain, which leaks through the thatched roof, or crusty from something your neighbor's chicken did. Either way, your bare feet are now part of the ecosystem. Oh, and privacy. What's that? Your entire family, and maybe a random cousin who just never left, are waking up beside you. There's no bedroom, no curtains, no me time, just communal everything. Welcome to morning in medieval Europe, where you're never truly alone because of parasites, rodents, and 8 other people are always with you. And this is just how your day starts. It only gets worse from here. So you've managed to crawl out of your medieval haystack of horse. Congrats. Now nature calls. And it's not calling politely. It's screaming. Here's the part where you start missing the modern bathroom. There's no toilet, no seat, no toilet paper, no flush, not even a mildly resentful plunger in the corner. In the 14th century, relieving yourself was an adventure, a social experiment, and often a small public event. If you're a peasant, your bathroom is likely a wooden bucket behind the house, which is already full because Uncle Wolf Stan had a rough night after eating bad turnips. The smell is biblical. You hold your breath, do your business, and then here's the kicker, toss it into the street. Yes, the street. You're supposed to shout something like Gardaloo before dumping it out the window. That's old French for watch out below, although frankly, no one ever moves fast enough. Streets in medieval towns are open sewers, a charming river of human waste, animal droppings, and mystery liquids you'd rather not examine. If you're lucky enough to live in a town with public latrines, congratulations. You get to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in an outhouse where privacy is a myth and ventilation is a cruel joke. You might make small talk, but try not to breathe too deeply. Toilet paper. Never heard of it. Most people wipe with straw, leaves, rags, moss, or if they're feeling especially indulgent, a scrap of wool. Sometimes nothing at all, which might explain why handshakes weren't popular yet. And if you're in a castle, surely it's better, right? Well, sort of. You might have a garderobe, a hole in the wall that drops your waist directly into the moat. Great idea. Except that your enemies know this. And yes, attackers sometimes climbed in through the waste chute. Talk about entering through the back door. So whether you're a farmer or a baron, medieval toileting is a humiliation ritual. It's cold, it's public, it's dangerous, and it's never not disgusting. One slip on a whetstone path. and your face first in humanity's leftovers. And you still haven't brushed your teeth. But we'll get to that next. You survived the toilet. You deserve a reward, right? Maybe a nice breakfast. Something warm, delicious, comforting. Sorry, this is medieval Europe. Nothing is comforting here. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is a grim affair. There are no eggs, Benedict, no coffee machines sputtering awake, and certainly no avocado toast. You sit down or squat near the fire to a wooden bowl of something that looks like it was scraped off a muddy boot. Welcome to your daily ration of pottage. Pottage is a thick, gloopy stew made of whatever you can find. Grains, root vegetables, maybe a few beans if you're lucky. It's been simmering in the same pot for days, sometimes weeks, and new ingredients are just dumped on top of the old ones. It's less of a recipe and more of an ongoing edible experiment. On the side, a hunk of bread so hard it could deflect arrows. It's made from coarse rye or barley flour, often bulked up with sawdust, ground up acorns, or other creative ingredients because wheat is a rich man's fantasy. This loaf is not your friend. You don't slice it, you negotiate with it. What about drinks? You're not sipping orange juice or an oat milk latte, you're drinking beer. Yes, beer at 6 a.m. Why? Because the water is teeming with parasites and filth. So you start your day with weak ale, low alcohol, and high survivability. Kids drink it too. No one's happy about it, but at least it won't kill you immediately. Want some meat or cheese? Dream on. That's for Sundays and saints' feast days, and only if your lord is feeling generous. Most peasants don't eat meat more than a few times a year. As for fresh fruit, only when it's in season and not already fermented into wine. And don't even think about spices unless you're royalty. A pinch of pepper costs more than your monthly wages. Salt is valuable enough to be locked away, so you chew your gritty bread, gulp your medieval beer, and try not to think about the rat that may have nibbled your porridge in the night. Breakfast doesn't energize you. It just happens to you. And now that you're properly underfed, it's time to work like your life depends on it, because it absolutely does. So you've eaten your sad medieval breakfast, and now it's time to get dressed. Not that it'll help. Your wardrobe consists of exactly one outfit. It's a ruffled tunic or linen shift that you've worn every day for months, possibly years. There's no such thing as seasonal fashion. Just wear this until it disintegrates or gives you a fungal infection. Underwear. Optional. If you're lucky, maybe a linen under a tunic. If you're not, well, you're going commando under layers of scratchy, sweaty wool, all lovingly stitched together by someone who probably had no idea what a seam was supposed to look like. There's also no washing machine, no soap, and absolutely no dry cleaner in sight. So your clothes are stained, stiff, and scented like a compost pile that's been left to marinate in a pigsty. Even if you wanted to wash them, it's not easy. You'd have to haul water from a river or well, heat it over a fire, scrub your tunic on a board with ashes or lye, and hang it in the sun, which is out approximately 3 days a year. And don't get me started on shoes. If you own any, they're made of untreated leather, barely stitched together, and offer as much arch support as a banana peel. Most peasants just go barefoot through mud, through dung, through medieval landmines, aka sharp rocks and disease puddles. All this means one thing. Your skin hates you. You itch constantly. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs live rent-free on your body. Everyone has them. Nobles, lousy monks, itchy children, walking insect farms. No one escapes. You'll be scratching your armpit with a wooden spoon while chatting with the local priest, and no one will even bat an eye. Your skin is raw from rubbing, your scalp a battlefield of bites. And if you develop a rash, well, too bad. There's no dermatologist, no hydrocortisone, no one to tell you it's probably scabies. You just keep on suffering. And if you're lucky enough to not get an infection, great. That rash will simply accompany you for the next 6 months like an unwanted medieval sidekick. Now that you're dressed in misery and wrapped in discomfort, it's time to head outside and start working yourself to death. Now that you're fully dressed in itches and damp wool, it's time to flash that morning smile. Except you don't. Because in the Middle Ages, smiling was a dangerous game. Not emotionally. Dentally. There's no toothbrush, no toothpaste, no mouthwash, no floss. The concept of oral hygiene is about as popular as bathing, which is to say, not very. Some people might chew on a twig or rinse with wine or vinegar, but for the most part, your teeth are on their own and they're not doing well. By the time you hit your mid-20s, your smile looks like something pulled from a haunted crypt. Cavities are rampant, gums are swollen, and those aren't just food stains on your teeth. That's decay. You have more rot in your mouth than a medieval root cellar. Sugar, while not yet everywhere, is becoming more common among the rich, imported at great cost, mostly used in small cakes or to show off wealth. If you're a noble, congratulations, you get to rot your teeth faster than the peasants. If you're poor, you'll do it slowly over time with fermented bread, gritty porridge, and years of hard chewing. Toothaches. Get used to them. They're like medieval weather, always there in the background. The kind of pain that makes you consider praying, drinking, or pulling the tooth out yourself with a pair of pliers. And that's not a joke. That was the actual treatment. Dentists didn't really exist, but barber surgeons did. Yes, the same guy who cuts your hair is also pulling your molars out by candlelight with an iron hook and zero anesthesia. Infected tooth. Hope you like fevers, because without antibiotics, it can easily turn into sepsis and kill you from a toothache. That's right. The same thing that sends us to a pharmacy today could be your funeral in the 1300s. And there's no relief on the social front either. Kissing. Good luck. Halitosis. Bad breath is everywhere. If you're single, you're not judged by your smile. You're judged by your land and your livestock. In short, your mouth is a battlefield, and it's losing the war. Now that your teeth are throbbing, let's head outside. Because your real job, the one that will break your back, is just getting started. Time to head to work. Except there's no office, no desk, no coffee break, and no chance of promotion. Your job, if you're like 90% of the population, is simple. Don't die while laboring for someone else's comfort. You're a peasant. Congratulations. That means you work the land that belongs to a lord who probably doesn't remember your name. You rise with the sun and stop only when it disappears behind the trees. Your tools? A wooden hoe or rusty sickle, and whatever bones are still intact in your body. There's no weekend. There's no clocking out. There's only sunrise to sunset. 6 days a week, Sunday is off, but only if you're not harvesting, fighting off raiders, or praying feverishly for your infected toe to stop turning black. The work is brutal. Fields are plowed by hand or with oxen if you're rich enough to afford one. You dig ditches, sow seeds, pull weeds, and carry water until your spine begins to resemble the letter S. No one cares if you're tired. No one's asking how your mental health is doing. If you're a woman, surprise. You don't just do field work. You also care for children. Clean, cook, spin wool, feed animals, then pretend your husband's lice infestation isn't slowly migrating to your side of the bed. Children, they start helping out around age 5. No school, no toys, just a tiny wooden rake and a dream of one day not dying of the flu. And if you're one of the few who isn't a farmer, maybe you're a blacksmith, a tanner, or a cooper. Great. You still work with fire, chemicals, or animal guts all day in poorly ventilated sheds. The pay? Basically survival. The perks? Occasional bleeding. Break a bone. Too bad. Get a fever, drink some warm beer, and keep going. You can't afford to stop, not even for a day, because if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, medieval Europe has a solution for that. It's called being replaced. So you grip your shovel, ignore the blisters, and keep digging. Because in the Middle Ages, your job wasn't a career. It's a slow-motion endurance test. Now that your back is on fire from laboring in the fields, let's talk about the weather. Because in the Middle Ages, temperature is less about seasons and more about ongoing punishment from the sky. Let's start with winter. There's no insulation, no central heating, and no weatherproofing. Just wooden walls with gaps you could throw a chicken through. Your windows are covered with cloth, not glass. The fire in the hearth. Nice in theory, but you don't have enough firewood to keep it going because wood is expensive and gathering it from the forest is sometimes illegal. Yes, you can be executed for picking up the wrong stick from the wrong forest. You bundle up in your one damp tunic, huddle near the dying embers, and still wake up with your nose frozen. Your feet are permanently cold, often damp. Your fingers are so stiff they feel like tiny medieval popsicles. Frostbite isn't diagnosed. It's just called bad luck. Now fast forward to summer. Sounds better, right? Wrong. In summer, your home turns into a clay oven. There's no fan, no cross breeze, and absolutely no deodorant. You sweat through your layers, but you can't remove them because showing too much skin is scandalous and also invites sunburn, insect bites, and social judgment. The flies are out in full force, attracted to your unwashed body and the smell of last week's goat stew that's still fermenting in a corner. Mosquitoes buzz by your ear while you sleep, assuming you can sleep through the sound of your neighbors yelling and babies crying in the fields. The sun bakes you. No sunblock, no hat, unless you fashion one out of straw like a desperate scarecrow. And the worst part, you still have to work. Heat stroke is just called taking a bad turn. So you're either shivering in your own hovel, wondering if your toes will make it to spring, or you're sweating through your only pair of socks while your thighs chafe into oblivion. And the one thing that never changes, no matter the season, your clothes still itch, your food is still terrible, and your next job, still waiting. Welcome to climate control, medieval style. There is none. Feeling thirsty? Need to freshen up. Want to splash a little water on your face to wake up from this damp fever dream of life? Too bad. In medieval times, water wasn't your friend. It's trying to murder you, quietly. Let's start with drinking. The nearby stream looks fresh, bubbling, and clear, like something out of a fantasy movie. But spoiler alert, it's not. Upstream, someone just dumped a chamber pot into it. And if not that, then a dead pig is probably decomposing in it. Parasites, bacteria, and the entire microbial army of medieval Europe are waiting in every sip. That's why people drank beer. Yes, beer, even children. But before you imagine medieval kids doing keg stands, understand that it was small beer, weak in alcohol, strong in survival. Brewing boiled the water, so it was safer than whatever flowed through the town ditch. Wine was another option if you were rich enough to afford it and unconcerned with functioning properly before noon. What about bathing? Surely water was used for cleaning. In theory, yes. In practice, absolutely not. See, back then, people believed bathing actually opened your pores and let the disease in. That's right, washing yourself was considered medically risky. You were cleaner, apparently, if you never removed the protective layer of filth caked onto your skin. Communal bathhouses did exist, but they quickly gained reputations as places for gossip, scandal, and sometimes full-on medieval extracurriculars. So naturally, the church got involved and shut many down. Even if you did want to bathe, it was a full production. You need to fetch water from the well, boil it over a fire, fill a wooden tub that leaked, and then pray no one else in the house used it before you. Or worse, after. And rainwater collected in open barrels where birds poop, insects breed, and moss thrives. Sounds refreshing, doesn't it? So whether it's going in your mouth, on your body, or onto your crops, water in the Middle Ages is less of a life source and more of a gamble. One wrong gulp, and you're spending your final days sweating in a straw bed, clutching your stomach, and contemplating all your life choices. Next time you sip tap water, raise a glass for our ancestors. They didn't have the luxury of hydration without hazard, so you drank the water. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you just stubbed your toe on a rock shaped like disappointment. Either way, you're sick. You need help. You need a doctor. Too bad you live in the Middle Ages, where medicine is really just polite torture with a theology degree. Let's start with the diagnosis. Everything wrong with you, whether it's a cough, rash, broken bone, or the creeping plague, is caused by your humors being out of balance. The four humors were blood, phlegm, and yellow bile, then black bile. According to medieval science, your health depends on keeping them balanced, like some sort of internal soup. Got a fever? Too much blood. The answer? Bloodletting. That's right. Let's drain your life force into a bowl using a dull blade or a hungry leech. And yes, barbers were often the ones doing it. Imagine getting a haircut and a hemoglobin extraction in one sitting, 2 for 1 baby, feeling sad or anxious. That's clearly an excess of black bile. The cure? Laxatives. Maybe a warm herbal purge, or just prayers and a cold compress while everyone avoids eye contact with you and starts carving your coffin. Now, if you break a bone or get a nasty wound, you're in real trouble. There's no anesthesia unless you count passing out from pain. Surgery is done with knives that haven't been cleaned since the Crusades. Tools are heated over fire, not for sterilization, but because they just look scarier that way. Antibiotics centuries away. Germ theory has not been invented yet. They think disease comes from bad air or God being annoyed with your moral failings. Got a stomachache? Must have been your sinful thoughts. Hope you like confessing while vomiting. If your condition gets worse, you'll be treated with more leeches, possibly some crushed beetles, and a priest at your bedside giving last rites just in case. At this point, they're preparing for the cure known as death, and if by some miracle you recover, everyone just assumes God took pity on you. The doctor takes full credit, and leech gets promoted. So yes, in the Middle Ages, medicine was less about healing and more about surviving the cure after a long day of labor, lice, and leeches. It's finally time to eat. You shuffle back to your hovel, stomach growling, ready for the one joy left in life. A warm meal. Bad news. Your meal is probably trying to kill you. Let's begin with the basics. Food preservation doesn't really exist. There's no fridge, no freezer, just salt, smoke, or the hope that winter air keeps things fresh. Your meat, if you're lucky enough to have any, has been hanging for days, covered in flies, marinated in questionable brine, and possibly shared with a rat or two. Bread is the cornerstone of the medieval diet, but even that isn't safe. In bad harvest years, desperate peasants bulk it up with bark, sawdust, or even clay to make it stretch. And if it's rye season, there's a bonus ergot, a fungus that causes convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. It's like eating bread laced with LSD and tetanus vegetables, only if they're in season. And you know what's always in season? Turnips. So many turnips, boiled, mashed, or floating in pottage, which, if you remember from Chapter 3, is basically a hot swamp of mystery ingredients that's been simmering since your great-grandfather's funeral. Fruit might be available in the fall, but it rots quickly and sugar is rare. Expensive and hoarded by the rich to show off their blackened teeth. Dairy is another gamble. Fresh milk spoils in hours. Butter and cheese fare better, but they're loaded with bacteria. People eat them anyway because, frankly, it's either that or chew your boot leather. And let's talk about seasoning. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg worth more than gold. For the average peasant, flavor comes from onion salt, if you're lucky. And pain? Most meals taste like wet burlap sprinkled with sadness. But food isn't just a health hazard. It's a political one. Game animals belong to the Lord, not you. Caught poaching a rabbit? You could be fined, imprisoned, or even executed. That's right, your dinner could get you hanged. So as you sit down to eat your gray stew by flickering firelight, remember, every bite is a risk. But you eat anyway, because in the Middle Ages, food didn't nourish. It tests you. It's evening now. You've worked, suffered, and barely digested your suspicious stew. You might think the day is winding down, but don't get too relaxed because God is watching. So is the priest, and so is your neighbor Agnes, who will absolutely rat you out if you miss Mass. In medieval Europe, religion isn't just part of life. It is life. The church controls your calendar, your laws, your education, if you can read your birth, marriage, death, and everything in between. Think of it as your spiritual landlord, and you're always behind on rent. Every day is structured around prayer bells. The town church bell rings in the morning, noon, and night. Not because people need reminders, but because missing prayer is a sin. Forget to bow. Sin. Eat meat on a Friday. Sin. Think about your neighbor's wife in that one dream. Double sin. And yes, hell is very real. Vividly real. priests describe it in glorious detail. Rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, demons with pitchforks, and eternal wailing. If the plague doesn't scare you, eternal damnation definitely will. You can't read the Bible yourself because it's written in Latin, a language reserved for monks, clergy, and that one noble kid who's too good for dirt. You rely on the church to interpret everything for you. That means if the priest says your crop failure is because you didn't pray hard enough, well, time to kneel harder. Tithe, 1/10 of everything you own, are mandatory. If you grow wheat, you give wheat. If you raise chickens, you give eggs. If you have nothing, congratulations. You're spiritually bankrupt and financially doomed. Holidays. They're holy days, dozens of them. And while they offer breaks from labor, they're not for fun. They're for attending Mass, fasting, confessing sins, and reminding yourself that joy is a dangerous indulgence. Questioning the church is dangerous. Heretics are burned, witches are drowned, blasphemers are flogged, and skeptics are quickly reformed. So you go through the motions, you chant, you bow, you pray that your soul, after enduring this dirt-covered life, might finally land in paradise, assuming the priest likes you. Because in the Middle Ages, God may be merciful, but the church not so much. If you thought being a medieval peasant was rough, try doing it as a woman. All the filth, famine and fear, plus childbirth, subservience, and social invisibility. In the Middle Ages, being a woman was like being in hard mode, with no health potions and no restart button. From birth, a girl's life path is pretty much locked in. Marry young, bear children, serve your husband, die tired. Education. Not likely. Unless you're from a noble family and sent to a convent, your intellectual development stops around the time you learn how to churn butter and patch a tunic. Marriage happens early. Really early. It's not weird to be betrothed at 12 and pregnant by 14. It's not about love. It's about land, livestock, and alliances. Your opinion, not required. Once married, you're basically your husband's property. Your job is to produce heirs, feed everyone, keep the house running, and not complain. Because complaining might get you branded a nag, or worse, a witch. That label comes with a complimentary drowning or burning, depending on local fashion. Childbirth is a death lottery. There's no prenatal care, no sterile tools, no anesthesia. Midwives do their best, but even minor complications can mean death for the mother, the child, or both. Some women survive 10 pregnancies. Many don't survive, too. But don't worry, once the baby is out, your work increases. Now you have a screaming infant in a lice-ridden hut, and you're expected to nurse, cook, clean, and still help in the fields. You don't get a break. You are the break for everyone else. If you're unmarried, you're suspicious. If you're widowed, vulnerable. If you're outspoken, dangerous. Women who didn't conform were often accused of witchcraft, especially if they had herbal knowledge, a strong personality, or just looked at someone funny on a rainy Tuesday. Even in the church, your role is limited. Nuns lived under strict rules. No speaking without permission, no freedom of movement, and your spiritual worth always ranked below men. In short, if you're a woman in the Middle Ages, you're expected to endure, obey, reproduce, and suffer in silence, ideally while smiling. Because even in a time of universal suffering, women were somehow expected to suffer gracefully. So far you've battled filth, starvation, social injustice, and possibly a goat. But just when you think your day can't get any worse, here comes violence. Loud, bloody, and often completely acceptable by medieval standards. Let's be clear, the Middle Ages were not peaceful. The idea of law and order mostly meant hope the local lord isn't in a bad mood. Violence is everywhere, in the home, in the streets, on the battlefield, in church disputes, and sometimes in line at the communal bread oven. Crime is common, punishment is brutal, and justice is more performance art than protection. Steal a loaf of bread, you could lose a hand. Accused of lying, your tongue might get pierced. Gossip too much. Meet the scold's bridle, a metal mask strapped to your head with a bar in your mouth. For correction, of course. Let's say you're accused of something serious. Heresy, theft, witchcraft. How do you prove your innocence? By being tortured, obviously. Welcome to Trial by Ordeal. One version, you stick your hand in boiling water to retrieve a stone. If it heals without infection in 3 days, you're innocent. If not, you're guilty. Another option, you're tossed into a river. If you sink, you're innocent and probably dead. If you float, you're guilty and will be punished anyway. It's like a medieval game show where the prize is survival and the host is actively rooting against you. And if you're sentenced to death, that's a public event. Executions are performed in front of cheering crowds. Hangings, beheadings, burnings. Sometimes people bring snacks. It's the medieval equivalent of cable TV. Domestic violence? Completely normal. Husbands were allowed, even expected, to discipline their wives and children. Street fights? Commonplace. You could be beaten just for looking the wrong way at a noble's horse. And war is always simmering. Local feuds, territorial disputes, religious crusades. Someone's always marching off to stab someone else in the name of honor, God, or boredom. Violence isn't a breakdown of society in the Middle Ages. It is society. Everyone lives with a constant knowledge that life is fragile. Justice is arbitrary, and your neighbor might bash your head in over a pig. So walk carefully, keep your eyes down, and never trust anyone with a club. At this point, you've made it through the lice, the leeches, the laundry-less misery, and the looming threat of public disembowelment. But now comes the final chapter of most medieval lives, an early and unglamorous death. If you're alive and still breathing past the age of 40, you're practically a celebrity. You might even be referred to as the Old One, which is less of a nickname and more of a statistical miracle. Let's break it down. The average life expectancy hovers around 30 to 40 years, but that number is dragged down heavily by infant mortality. Nearly half of all children die before reaching age 5. Disease, malnutrition, or one bad winter was all it took. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no hope if you survived childhood. You entered adulthood already exhausted. Work began as soon as you could walk upright, and by 25 your joints creaked like a monastery door. You might be missing several teeth, a finger, and most of your original optimism. Women faced a particularly deadly gauntlet, childbirth. It was one of the leading causes of death for medieval women. No pain relief, no medical intervention, just prayer, hot water, and someone holding your hand while you bled out on a straw stuffed cot for men. The dangers were different, but equally relentless. Farming accidents, infections from minor wounds, a neighbor's drunken rage, a crusade gone sideways. Even walking to the market could be risky if you crossed paths with a bored bandit or an angry tax collector. Death could also come quietly from the plague, which turned cities into cemeteries overnight, or from famine, which could last entire seasons, thinning out entire villages, or from bad luck, like eating spoiled grain and spending your final hours hallucinating and screaming at the walls and funerals. You were lucky if you got one. Bodies were often buried quickly to avoid disease. No embalming, no polished coffins, just a hole, a few murmured prayers, and a shallow mound of earth, if there was enough space left in the churchyard. So yes, in medieval times, life was brutal, short, and constantly under siege by death in all its casual forms. You didn't retire. You just stopped showing up. And speaking of exits, let's move on to your final chapter. The medieval dream dies. So how's your day been? You've woken up in filth, relieved yourself into a bucket, brushed your teeth with wishful thinking, nearly passed out from hunger, worked until your spine cried for mercy, scratched your way through itchy wool, prayed to not get plague, and barely dodged a public execution for owning a squirrel. Welcome to a single day in medieval Europe. Still dreaming of becoming a knight? Think again. That romanticized version of the Middle Ages. Gallant swordsmen, noble ladies in towers, heroic battles and feasts in candle-lit great halls. It's a myth polished by fairy tales and fantasy books. In truth, the medieval world was gritty, cruel, and deeply unfair. Hierarchy was everything. If you were born poor, you stayed poor. If you were born rich, congratulations. You had a better chance of surviving, but you were still one bad soup away from dysentery and a hasty burial. Even the nobles weren't immune to misery. Castles were drafty stone refrigerators filled with fleas, smoke, and politically motivated marriages. Sure, you had a fur cloak and a goblet of wine, but also a 50% chance of dying in a skirmish or from an infected splinter. Not exactly luxury. The simpler times weren't simple. They were relentless. Everything took longer. Everything hurts more. Everything. From childbirth to chewing came with consequences. Life was survival, not leisure. And if you did find a quiet moment to think, to dream, to imagine something better, there wasn't much you could do with it. No upward mobility, no modern medicine, no internet to Google. What's this weird, Resh? You lived, suffered, worked and died within a 10-mile radius of where you were born. But here's the wildest part. Through all of this, people still laughed, sang songs, told stories, fell in love and found meaning. Not because life was easy, but because humans are stubborn like that. Even in the darkest chapters, they made space for light. So tonight, when you slip into your clean bed with indoor plumbing, antibiotics, and central heating, maybe say a quiet thank you to the modern world and to your ancestors who fought rats, famine, and feudalism so you wouldn't have to. Long before she was Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, mistress of reform, and icon of ambition, she was simply Sophie. Born Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, she was the daughter of a relatively obscure German princely family. Her tiny duchy in Pomerania offered little in terms of power, but Sophie herself, she had something no title could provide. Razor-sharp intelligence, relentless charm, and a quiet, burning hunger for greatness. Her upbringing was strict. Her mother, Johanna, was cold and calculating. Not a warm, nurturing figure, but a social climber obsessed with status. Sophie's father, a Prussian officer, was more distant than disciplinary. From a young age, Sophie learned to walk the fine line between obedience and cunning. She read voraciously, spoke multiple languages, and learned how to observe a room before speaking in it, skills that would soon become survival tools in one of Europe's most brutal courts. When the Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrovna began searching for a wife for her heir, Grand Duke Peter, she looked beyond Russia's borders. Peter himself was of German descent, and Empress Elizabeth believed a foreign bride, pliable and grateful, would be easier to control. Sophie fit the bill perfectly. Noble blood, Lutheran faith, which she'd be forced to abandon, and a reputation for both grace and humility. At just 14 years old, Sophie was summoned to Russia. She arrived in the freezing capital of St. Petersburg in 1744, wearing thin German fabrics and a diplomatic smile. Her mother pushed her forward like a chess piece. Sophie, however, had her own game in mind. To become acceptable in Russian society, she converted to Orthodoxy, taking the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna Catherine. The ceremony was public, symbolic, and life-altering. She wasn't just changing religions. She was burning the bridge behind her, stepping into a foreign empire with no way back. No one watching that quiet teenage girl in a fur-trimmed coat could have predicted what would come next. Betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, and empire. But from the moment Sophie stepped foot in the Russian court, she stopped being a pawn and began planning how to become a queen. Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was meant to secure her place in Russian royalty, but from the very beginning it felt more like a cage than a crown. Peter, heir to the Russian throne, was not the dashing prince of fairy tales. Awkward, immature, and obsessed with toy soldiers, he was far more interested in playing war games in his chambers than governing an empire or showing affection to his new wife. Some accounts even suggest he refused to consummate the marriage for years. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia and resented the Russian court that had adopted him. In contrast, Catherine embraced Russia with a fierce determination. She learned the language, studied its history, and memorized Orthodox rituals. She wanted to belong. Peter wanted to escape. This mismatch wasn't just emotional, it was political. The Russian court was a viper's nest of gossip, paranoia, and brutal power games. Empress Elizabeth still ruled with absolute authority, but her health was in decline. Everyone knew a transition was coming, and everyone had an agenda. Catherine was watched constantly. Her letters were read, her friendships monitored, and her every move scrutinized. She couldn't trust her husband, her mother, who was still whispering in her ear on behalf of foreign interests, or even her servants. In this world, alliances could turn into accusations overnight, but Catherine was no fool. She learned to play the court's games quietly, cultivating allies in the shadows. She charmed military officers, made friends with scholars, and developed a reputation for dignity and restraint, a stark contrast to her husband's childish tantrums and open contempt for Russian traditions. Behind closed doors, Catherine began reading Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu. While others saw her as a young consort, she was building a vision not just for herself, but for Russia, a nation of strength, education, and reason. But there was one problem. The longer Peter lived, the longer Catherine remained in limbo, a powerless wife to a man unfit to rule. So she waited, observed, and planned. She knew the Russian throne wouldn't be inherited. It would have to be taken. In 1762, after nearly 2 decades of waiting, watching, and quietly maneuvering, Catherine saw her moment and seized it with breathtaking precision. Empress Elizabeth had died, and Peter, now Peter III, was finally Tsar. But his reign began unraveling almost immediately. In just a few short months, Peter alienated the church, offended the nobility, insulted the army, and lavished praise on Prussia, Russia's longtime enemy. He reversed key policies, humiliated the clergy, and talked openly about divorcing Catherine to marry his mistress. The court, already wary of his erratic behavior, turned cold. The army, filled with generals loyal to Catherine, grumbled in corridors. Even ordinary Russians, devout and patriotic, saw Peter as a foreign puppet who mocked their traditions. Catherine, watching all of this unfold, made her move in July of that same year, while Peter was away at his summer palace. Catherine launched a bloodless coup d'etat supported by key military officers, including her lover Grigory Orlov and his influential brothers. She rode through St. Petersburg in full regalia, was proclaimed Empress Catherine II, and won the allegiance of the powerful Imperial Guard. Peter, caught off guard and without allies, surrendered within days. He was taken into custody and shortly after found dead under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was reported as a hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, it was murder. Catherine was now empress, not by birth, not by marriage, but by will, wit, and audacity. It was unprecedented. A foreign-born woman with no legitimate claim had taken the Russian throne without a single battle. But her real challenge was just beginning. She had to transform that bold grab for power into a lasting legacy. Would Russia accept her? Would the nobility respect her? Could she hold the empire together without falling victim to the same fate as her husband? Catherine understood that power gained through intrigue could be lost just as easily. She needed to rule not as a schemer, but as a visionary. And so began her transformation from a careful conspirator to a reforming empress, one who would redraw borders, embrace the Enlightenment, and redefine what it meant to be a woman in power. Once Catherine had the crown, she could have rested on her power, but she didn't. She had something bigger in mind than simply sitting on a throne. She wanted to transform Russia, and not just militarily or politically, but intellectually. While Peter had worshipped Frederick the Great and toy soldiers, Catherine idolized Voltaire, Diderot, and the bold thinkers of the Enlightenment. She believed in reason, progress, education, and the role of a monarch as a servant of the people. Even if she herself ruled with absolute authority, Catherine didn't just read Enlightenment philosophy, she lived it. She corresponded directly with Voltaire for over 15 years, flattering him while defending her autocracy. She invited Diderot to her court and even purchased his entire library to support him financially. Behind closed doors, she pored over legal texts, debated reforms, and crafted policies to modernize the empire. Her early reign was filled with efforts to codify Russian law. She formed the Legislative Commission in 1767, an ambitious project intended to rewrite the entire legal code of Russia. Catherine's own nakaz, or instruction, was a political manifesto in disguise, one that spoke of equality before the law, the dangers of torture, and the responsibility of rulers to serve the common good. For an empress in 18th century Russia, it was radical. But Enlightenment ideals had to survive the realities of Russia, a vast, feudal, deeply conservative land, ruled by nobles who liked their serfs exactly where they were beneath them. Catherine knew this. While she advocated reform, she moved carefully. She abolished some forms of torture, expanded access to secular education, and built schools and libraries. But she also reaffirmed the nobility's control over their serfs to keep them loyal. This was Catherine's balancing act. A philosopher queen in public, a practical empress in private, she walked a tightrope between ideology and survival, between the shining salons of Paris and the gritty politics of Moscow. Her vision for Russia was bold, but always calculated. In many ways, Catherine wasn't trying to make Russia European. She was trying to make Russia modern on her terms, and that meant reform, yes, but with an iron hand and a velvet glove. Catherine wasn't content with reforming Russia from within. She wanted to expand it outward to make it an empire worthy of fear, admiration, and envy. Where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west, Catherine aimed to knock down the walls. Under her leadership, Russia's borders stretched wider than ever before. She waged wars not just to defend her crown, but to reshape the map of Europe. One of her most significant campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These wars, fought in waves throughout the 1760s and 1770s, weren't just about territory, they were about influence. Catherine saw herself as the liberator of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule and as the rightful protector of Eastern Europe. Under generals like Alexander Suvorov and Grigory Potemkin, Russia captured key regions including Crimea, the northern coast of the Black Sea, and access to warm water ports, something Russian czars had coveted for generations. These victories weren't just military, they were symbolic. With each conquest, Catherine sent a message. Russia was no longer the distant, backward cousin of Europe. It was a continental force. She also turned her gaze westward. In a series of deals and diplomatic maneuvers, Catherine participated in the partitions of Poland, carving up the struggling Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth along with Austria and Prussia. By the end of the Third Partition in 1795, Poland was erased from the map, and Russia claimed vast new lands and millions of new subjects. But Catherine didn't just conquer armies, she also colonized with ideas. New cities were built, trade routes were expanded, German settlers were invited to cultivate Russian farmland. The empire became a mosaic from the icy Baltic to the sun-drenched shores of the Black Sea, and through it all, Catherine remained a central force, reading reports, issuing orders, and personally overseeing the shape of her expanding empire. Critics would accuse her of being power-hungry, even imperialistic. But to Catherine, expansion wasn't ambition. It was destiny. A great ruler, she believed, was measured not just by ideas, but by borders. She didn't just want to rule Russia. She wanted to remake it as a civilized empire, feared by its enemies, respected by its peers, and loyal to her alone. For all her brilliance and power, Catherine the Great was just as famous for what went on behind palace doors. And no, not all of it was whispered in libraries. Catherine's private life became one of the most talked about aspects of her reign. She had lovers, not just one or two, but a carefully curated parade of them, many decades younger, often handsome and sometimes politically influential. She didn't hide them. In fact, she often rewarded them with titles, estates, and pensions if they behaved well. If not, they were quietly dismissed, sometimes with a polite thank you and a promotion. Among the most important of these lovers was Grigory Potemkin, a man as brilliant as he was bold. Their relationship blurred the lines between romance, politics, and partnership. Some historians believe they may have even married in secret. Together, they shaped military campaigns, colonization projects, and the transformation of southern Russia. Potemkin wasn't just a lover. He was her co-ruler in many ways. Still, Europe couldn't look past the scandal. Gossip swirled. Satirical pamphlets painted her as lustful, insatiable, even unhinged. And after her death, the rumors only got worse. The most infamous being the completely false and grotesque tale involving a horse spread by her enemies to smear her legacy. But why the obsession? Simple. Catherine was a woman who wielded power unapologetically, and in a world where female rulers were expected to be either saintly virgins or tragic figures, she refused to play the role. She lived, loved, and ruled on her own terms, and that made her dangerous. Ironically, while her critics painted her as immoral, Catherine herself was deeply philosophical about love and sexuality. She believed pleasure was a natural part of life, and that personal relationships didn't have to threaten public responsibility. She separated emotion from governance, a feat few male rulers managed. In reality, her liaisons were often strategic. She surrounded herself with men who were loyal, capable, and politically useful, and when they ceased to be, she let them go, usually with a smile and a generous retirement. Catherine's love life didn't weaken her rule. It was part of her strategy, a blend of passion and power that made her unforgettable, envied and feared. For all her charisma and control, Catherine's reign was not without peril. And in 1773, that peril came in the form of a bearded Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev. He was no ordinary rebel. Pugachev claimed to be none other than Peter III, Catherine's dead husband, according to him. He had survived the coup and now returned to reclaim the throne from the German usurper. It was absurd. Peter was long gone. But to Russia's oppressed and exhausted lower classes, the claim didn't need to be true. It just needed to offer hope. Pugachev promised liberation, an end to serfdom, lower taxes, and land for the common people. His words lit a fire across the Volga River region, especially among Cossacks, peasants, and old believers. In a time when the gap between nobles and serfs had widened brutally, his promises sounded like salvation. The Pugachev Rebellion became the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Towns were taken, fortresses fell, nobles were slaughtered. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as if the empire itself might fracture. Catherine was shaken. This wasn't a foreign war she could win with cavalry and treaties. This was a revolt from within. Her own people rising against the system she ruled. But Catherine didn't panic. She acted. She dispatched professional military forces to crush the rebellion ruthlessly. Pugachev's forces were defeated in 1774. He was captured, displayed in an iron cage, and eventually beheaded in Moscow, a public warning to all who dared follow. Afterward, Catherine doubled down on order and control. Her dreams of liberating the serfs quietly faded into silence. The rebellion had shown her the limits of enlightenment in a country still shackled by feudalism. She now leaned harder on the nobility, who offered loyalty in exchange for absolute control over their serfs. This was a turning point. The Empress, who once quoted Voltaire, now prioritized stability over philosophy. Reform became cautious. Surveillance increased. Rebellion, even whispered, was to be stomped out before it had breath. Pugachev may have lost his head, but he left behind a warning that haunted Catherine, that power built on inequality could only hold so long before the storm came crashing through. By the time Catherine the Great approached the final years of her life, she had ruled Russia for over 3 decades, longer than any female ruler in Russian history. From the moment she seized power, she had defied expectations, reshaped her empire, and redefined what a woman and a monarch could be. Under Catherine's reign, Russia became a true European powerhouse. Its territory expanded by over 200,000 square miles, swallowing Crimea, parts of Poland, and stretches of the Black Sea coast. These weren't just military wins, they were strategic pivots, securing warm water ports and reshaping trade. But her legacy wasn't only drawn on maps. Catherine left a cultural mark as well. She helped found the Hermitage Museum, amassed one of the greatest art collections in Europe, and corresponded with the greatest minds of the Enlightenment. Her court became a center of sophistication, art, and intellectual ambition. In a country often viewed as backward by Western Europeans, Catherine put Russia firmly on the cultural map. She modernized education, founding schools for girls, and promoted the printing of books. She introduced smallpox inoculation to Russia, even publicly receiving the vaccine herself, an act of scientific bravery in her time. Yet her reign was also one of contradictions. While she admired Enlightenment ideals, she never freed the serfs. In fact, she extended serfdom deeper into Russia's territories. Her reforms, while impressive, remained mostly top-down, designed to polish the empire without truly transforming its foundations. Still, Catherine's rule brought stability and ambition. She understood that power was not inherited. It was crafted, managed, and constantly defended. She ruled not by divine right, but by force of will, political brilliance, and relentless calculation. She was called many things: a usurper, a tyrant, a reformer, a seductress, but above all, she was effective. When she died in 1796, Russia was wealthier, larger, and more formidable than it had been in centuries. She left behind a throne secure, an empire expanded, and a legend that would endure for centuries. Catherine didn't just reign. She ruled with intellect, strategy, and an unapologetic grip on history. And in doing so, she became more than an empress. She became a myth. For all her power, expansion, and enduring legacy, Catherine the Great was still, at her core, a woman navigating a man's world and reshaping it in her image. Behind the imperial portraits and state decrees was someone deeply aware of how precarious her position was. She was not born Russian. She came to the throne through a coup. She ruled an empire that didn't want a woman in charge, and yet she not only endured, she thrived. Catherine was never content to be ornamental. She read constantly, wrote endlessly, and never stopped learning. Her daily schedule was intense. Hours of reading reports, corresponding with foreign powers, editing state papers, and managing a court filled with rival factions. She wasn't content to simply sit on the throne. She worked the throne like a stateswoman born to it. She was also, in many ways, lonely. She surrounded herself with courtiers, lovers, and artists, yet wrote in her memoirs of how few people she could truly trust. Her son Paul, whom she distrusted and kept away from state matters, grew into a man she feared would undo all her progress. Her greatest emotional partnership with Grigory Potemkin faded into deep friendship, but his death in 1791 left a wound that never truly healed. Catherine crafted her image carefully. She understood the power of narrative and wielded it better than most monarchs of her age. She posed as Mother of Russia, enlightened monarch, warrior, empress, and lover of the arts. But beneath those roles was a woman who had endured rejection, betrayal, scandal, and rebellion, and kept going. When she died in 1796, she left behind an empire transformed, but also questioned. Could she have done more to end serfdom? Were her Enlightenment ideals compromised by politics? Was she a reformer or ruler? History remembers her by the title she never gave herself, the Great. It wasn't because she was flawless or kind or just. It was because she took power and wielded it on her own terms in a time and place where women weren't supposed to have any. She didn't just wear the crown. She rewrote what it meant to deserve one. In the humid depths of the Chiapas jungle in southern Mexico, the ruins of Palenque whisper stories from the ancient Maya world. Towering temples rise above the canopy, their limestone faces eroded by time, but still brimming with secrets. And in 1994, one of those secrets revealed itself. A team of Mexican archaeologists led by Fanny Lopez Jimenez was surveying Temple Thurin, a relatively modest pyramid next to the more famous Temple of the Inscriptions, the burial site of the mighty King Paykal the Great. Temple Thurin wasn't expected to hold much until they noticed something odd, a sealed, hidden chamber beneath the structure. No looters had touched it. It was pristine when the archaeologists broke through and lowered themselves inside. They found a stone sarcophagus resting in silence. The air was heavy with the weight of centuries. As they opened the lid, red dust rose like smoke. Brilliant, shocking red. The interior was covered in powdered cinnabar, a toxic mercury sulfide used ceremonially by the Maya, and lying within that crimson cloud was the skeleton of a woman. She had been buried with care and reverence. Her bones were fragile but intact, her skull still wearing a jade mask, and her body surrounded by funerary offerings, necklaces, diadems, ear spools, all crafted from jade and shell. Everything about the burial screamed royalty, yet no name was inscribed. No glyphs identified her. It was one of the richest female burials ever found in Mesoamerica, and yet it was a total enigma. Why was she buried in red powder? Who was she? Was she a queen, a priestess, or perhaps even Paykal's wife? The researchers called her the Red Queen, and the name stuck. But even with modern forensics, they couldn't say for sure who she was. only that she had lived around the 7th century, during the golden age of Pallas. Unlike most Maya tombs, hers had been hidden, untouched, and purposefully isolated. Her burial wasn't just ceremonial, it was spiritual. This woman wasn't meant to be remembered with words. She was meant to be remembered through ritual, through color, and through the mystery she left behind. The most haunting feature of the Red Queen's tomb wasn't her jade jewelry or the silence of the sealed chamber. It was the red dust. A thick layer of powdered cinnabar covered everything. The sarcophagus, the walls. Her bones, even the offerings around her, clung like blood to stone. To the Maya, this was no accident. Cinnabar, made from crushed mercury sulfide, was one of the most sacred and dangerous substances in the ancient world. Its vibrant red color wasn't just visually striking. It symbolized blood, rebirth, and the life force that connected the human and divine realms. Red was sacred. It was the color of sunrise, of sacrifice, of life emerging from death. And it wasn't just symbolic, it was spiritual. Covering the dead in cinnabar was a ritual meant to transform the body, preserving it not for eternity, but for transition. In Maya belief, death wasn't the end. It was a passage, a crossing into another cosmic layer. And so the Red Queen, whoever she was being prepared not just for burial, but for deification. But there's another layer to this. Cinnabar is toxic. Repeated exposure can lead to mercury poisoning, tremors, hallucinations, even death. The Maya likely didn't understand the chemistry, but they felt its potency. It was volatile, powerful, and dangerous. To bathe the corpse in it was to declare this person was no ordinary mortal in Palak. Very few were buried with cinnabar. Pakal the Great, the mighty king whose pyramid dominates the site, was one. His body, like hers, was also saturated in the red powder. That detail alone drew speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife, his mother, or someone of equal divine status? Her skull had been placed on a layer of jaguar skin, another sacred symbol around her. Bone needles, obsidian blades, and miniature jade figurines hinted at rituals performed either during her life or in her honor at death. Every part of her burial told a story without words, a story of power cloaked in secrecy, a woman prepared to cross into the underworld, not in silence but in ceremony, drenched in the color of sacrifice. Surrounding the Red Queen's crimson-drenched remains was a world of silence, broken only by the gleam of jade, shell, and obsidian. These were not mere ornaments. They were offerings, each one carefully chosen to accompany her on the journey to the Maya afterlife, the Xibalba. At her sides were jade necklaces, heavy and cold, their polished surfaces still radiant after 300 years underground. Jade was not just beautiful, it was sacred. The Maya considered it a symbol of eternal life. It represented the green of maize, the vitality of the jungle, and the breath of the gods. Only the elite were buried with jade. For the Red Queen, it covered her chest, wrists, and ears, a clear sign that in life she wielded influence, perhaps even in divine favor. One of the most haunting objects was the jade funerary mask, placed delicately over her face. Unlike the golden death masks of Egypt, this one was subtle, constructed from dozens of tiny mosaic tiles arranged to mimic the contours of her skull. The masks serve a ritual function to protect the soul, to preserve identity, and to present her as divine in the eyes of the gods. Scattered near her bones were bone needles, obsidian blades, and shell artifacts. These could have been tools of ritual or symbols of her status as priestess, healer, or royal matriarch. One bone pin was engraved, faint but purposeful, a small echo of her voice lost to time. At her feet and along the edges of the tomb were ceramic vessels, still sealed, likely once filled with offerings. Food, drink, or incense to sustain her spirit beyond death. The Maya believed the afterlife was a journey, dangerous, layered, filled with challenges. These items weren't luxuries, they were necessities. To modernize, the tomb feels intimate, not overloaded, but intentional. There was no gold, no chariots, no pomp, just items chosen with spiritual weight. It was a map for the soul. Through these treasures, we glimpse how the Maya understood death, not as finality, but as a transition of power. The Red Queen wasn't buried to be forgotten. She was being prepared to ascend. For all the grandeur of her tomb, the Red Queen left behind one haunting void. No name, no inscriptions adorned her sarcophagus. No glyphs on the walls identified her. She was clearly someone powerful. But who? From the moment her tomb was opened, scholars began trying to connect the dots. The most compelling theory? The Red Queen was Zakbuaho, the wife of Kinich-Janab Pakal, known today as Pakal the Great, the most famous ruler of Palau. Zakbuaho was more than just Pakal's consort. She was born into nobility and married into Palong's royal dynasty at a young age. She bore at least 3 sons, all of whom held high status, and she played a key ceremonial role during her husband's reign. If anyone could be buried with such honor, it was her. Supporting this theory was the tomb's location, just a few feet away from Pakal's own grand burial in the Temple of the Inscriptions. The proximity suggests a deliberate pairing, husband and wife, rulers even in death. And then there's the cinnabar. Only 2 burials in Palanque were found with such intense cinnabar coverage, Pakal and the Red Queen. It's unlikely this was coincidence, but here's where the mystery deepens. DNA tests were conducted on both sets of remains in hopes of confirming the connection. But the results? Inconclusive. The woman's bones showed no direct maternal link to Pakal, but that didn't rule out a spousal relationship after all. Marriage does not require shared blood. Some have argued she could have been Sakkup, Pakal's powerful mother, who ruled Palanque before he came of age. Others suggest she may have been a high priestess or a sister or a royal ancestor whose name has simply been lost to history's erosion. Still, the evidence points most strongly to Tsakbuajau, a queen by title, a mother of kings, and a spiritual counterpart to Pakal. The lack of a name may not be an oversight. It may have been intentional. In Maya cosmology, the soul lived on not through monuments, but through ritual, symbol, and the whispers of the earth. And so the Red Queen remained suspended between legend and truth. A woman who ruled, remembered not in stone, but in scarlet and silence. To understand the Red Queen, we must understand the world she came from. A world where Maya women, especially royal ones, held more influence than many realize. In Maya civilization, politics was often a family affair. Royal women weren't merely passive consorts. They were diplomats, priestesses, and power brokers. They conducted rituals, sponsored temples, and played crucial roles in maintaining dynastic legitimacy. Their bloodlines were political capital, used to forge alliances and secure claims to the throne. Take Sakkup, for example, the mother of Pakal the Great. When the throne of Palanque was left vacant, she took power herself and ruled as queen regent until her son came of age. She wasn't a placeholder. She was a ruler in her own right, issuing decrees and overseeing construction projects. Without her, Pakal may never have risen at all, and she wasn't an anomaly. Across the Maya world, in places like Yaxchilan, Naranjo, and Calakmul, inscriptions show women performing major ceremonies, engaging in warfare diplomacy, and sometimes ruling outright. They were often portrayed in steles and murals, dressed in elaborate headdresses and regalia, standing beside kings as equals, or sometimes above them. Their words were carved in glyphs. Their names were remembered until they weren't. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later, much of that memory had eroded. The colonial lens saw native women as silent figures in a male-dominated world. But the archaeology tells a different story, one of complex gender roles where power was negotiated, not simply inherited. This context casts the Red Queen in a new light. She may not have ruled in name, but her burial, rich, sacred, and positioned beside Pakal, suggests she was a central pillar in the royal order. Her jade mask wasn't just decoration, it was a symbol of identity, a power held in life and protected in death. Her bloodline may have been the very glue that held Palanca's dynasty together. In Maya civilization, a queen wasn't just a queen. She was a keeper of sacred lineage, a voice in ceremony, and often the bridge between gods and men. The Red Queen may be nameless, but in her world, she was never voiceless. The Red Queen wasn't just buried with treasures. She was buried in architecture rich with purpose, layered with Maya cosmology, ritual symbolism, and intentional design. Her tomb wasn't merely a grave. It was a gateway to eternity. Her body was discovered inside Temple Thade, one of the smaller pyramids within the heart of Palenque. Yet its proximity to the Temple of the Inscriptions, the resting place of Pakel the Great, is telling. These temples weren't built randomly. Their positioning was sacred, guided by astrology, myth, and dynastic legacy. Temple the Thartid rises modestly compared to its grand neighbor, but it hides something even more intimate, a sealed crypt, untouched by looters, perfectly preserved. It was constructed deep within the temple's core, accessible only by a steep, narrow staircase. The descent into her tomb feels almost symbolic, a ritual journey downward into the underworld. The chamber itself is stark, made of cut stone, sealed tightly for over 1,300 years. No glyphs or murals cover the walls. No ornate carvings tell her story. But perhaps that silence is intentional. This was a space not for the living to interpret, but for the dead to transform. At the center, her sarcophagus sits like an altar. Crafted from limestone, it echoes the grand stone coffin of Pakel next door. While Pakel's lid is famously engraved with scenes of cosmic rebirth, the Red Queen's tomb is more subdued. The focus is inward on the body, on the cinnabar, on the ritual of death itself. And yet there are subtle architectural cues that hint at meaning. The tomb is aligned east to west, a symbolic path mirroring the sun's journey from life to death. The chamber is small but powerful. It feels deliberate, personal, a sacred enclosure for someone revered. Maya temples were cosmological tools, bridges between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. To be buried in one was to be elevated beyond the human realm. The Red Queen's eternal home wasn't an afterthought. It was a carefully constructed shrine, a place where death became transformation. Her bones rest in stone, her essence in cinnabar, and her legacy in the architecture itself. A temple that speaks without words, telling us she mattered. To the ancient Maya, death was an end. It was a threshold, a sacred passage into the underworld known as Xibalba. And for someone like the Red Queen, this crossing was not only spiritual, it was political, cosmological, and deeply ritualized. Burial rituals were carefully choreographed events rooted in myth and meant to guide the soul through the treacherous layers of the underworld. Maya texts and iconography tell us that Xibalba, there was no peaceful afterlife. It was a maze of darkness, rivers of blood, trials, and gods of death. Only those properly buried, ritually prepared, and spiritually equipped could make the journey successfully. The Red Queen was buried, wrapped in cinnabar, encased in stone, and surrounded by offerings, all signs of an elite burial. But there's more: the presence of bone needles and obsidian blades in her tomb hints at auto-sacrifice rituals, possibly symbolic tools representing rites she had performed in life or that were reenacted at her burial to empower her spirit. Her funerary mask, carefully assembled from jade tiles, was not simply decorative. It may have served as a spiritual vessel, preserving her face and identity as she journeyed into the afterlife. In Maya belief, the face was a mirror of the soul, and the soul needed to be recognized by the gods. The ceramic vessels surrounding her may have once held chocolate, maize, water, or even polka to nourish her in the next world. Other items, like stingray spines or shell trumpets, could have represented spiritual tools, calls to the gods, or tokens of ritual communication. Burial wasn't just a goodbye, it was a transformation. The Maya believed in cycles: death is seed, burial is planting, and the afterlife is rebirth. Kings and queens were often seen as earthly incarnations of gods, and in death they returned to those divine origins. The Red Queen, covered in the color of blood, entombed in a pyramid and honored with offerings, was being prepared for rebirth, not as a mortal, but as a being tied to the sacred order of the cosmos. Her burial wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning of her legend. Just a few steps away from the Red Queen's final resting place lies one of the most iconic tombs in Mesoamerica, that of Kinich Janab Pakel, known simply as Pakel the Great. His burial inside the Grand Temple of the Inscriptions is celebrated for its artistry, scale, and deeply spiritual symbolism. But what makes the Red Queen's tomb so extraordinary is not only what was inside, it's where it was found. Her sarcophagus was hidden within Temple 3, directly adjacent to Pakel's monument. In a city like Palenque, where every temple was carefully positioned to reflect cosmic principles. This closeness was no coincidence. It was intentional, a statement etched in stone. Many scholars believe the Red Queen was Zakbuajau, Pakal's queen and trusted consort. While her tomb lacks inscriptions, the similarities between their burials are striking, both wrapped in cinnabar, both entombed in pyramids, both buried with jade, and both treated with extreme reverence. These rituals mirror each other as if two halves of a sacred narrative. Pakal's lid famously depicts him falling into the underworld tree, a cosmic scene of death and rebirth. The Red Queen's simpler tomb contains no such iconography, but the symbolism lies in the pairing itself if Pakal represented the sun, journeying through the underworld at night to rise again. Then the Red Queen may have represented the moon, a feminine force that follows its own mysterious path in the sky. Together they embodied a cosmic duality, masculine and feminine, king and queen, sun and moon, order and ritual. In Maya mythology, rulership was not singular, it was relational. Harmony in the cosmos required balance, and that balance extended into the dynastic court. By placing the Red Queen beside Pakal, the Maya were preserving not just a marriage, but a cosmic partnership. Their proximity in death may have mirrored their roles in life, a queen not behind, but beside her king, sharing not just a throne, but a legacy. In their tombs they speak without words, two souls wrapped in cinnabar and stone, joined across eternity, one of history's most sacred silences. Though her name was lost to time, the Red Queen of Palenque endures not as a forgotten relic, but as one of the most enigmatic and powerful women of the ancient world. Her tomb, sealed for over 1,300 years, now whispers across centuries, inviting questions that echo louder with every discovery. She represents a mystery that still resists full understanding. We may never know exactly who she was. No glyph carved her name, no steeler told her story. And yet the care in her burial, the richness of her offerings, the symbolism of her crimson-drenched bones, all speak of a woman profoundly important, not merely as a wife or consort, but as someone who held real influence, spiritual weight, and royal blood. Today, the Red Queen forces us to reevaluate assumptions. She's a reminder of the ancient Maya world. Women were not silent. They led rituals, governed cities, and shaped dynasties. While kings like Pakal have long taken the spotlight, the Red Queen's reemergence reminds us that power did not belong to men alone. It flowed through mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries. Her legacy is more than the treasures she left behind. It's the conversation she started among archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers. Every jade bead, every layer of cinnabar, every architectural choice in Temple Thedhead tells us something deliberate. This woman mattered, and perhaps that's the most extraordinary part of her story. Not what we know, but what we still don't. The Red Queen teaches us that history isn't just a collection of facts. It's a living puzzle, a shared human longing to connect with the past. In that sense, her legacy is still unfolding. She lies wrapped in red, the color of life and sacrifice, of blood and rebirth. Her face, once hidden behind a jade mask, now stares back at us through science, art, and wonder. She remains nameless, but not voiceless, mysterious, but not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death she rules something greater than our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone, her story was written in silence, and still, somehow, she speaks. Frida Kahlo was born on July 6, 1907, in the vibrant district of Coyoacán, then a village on the outskirts of Mexico City. Her childhood home, the Casa Azul, the Blue House, was filled with color contradiction and quiet strength. It would later become a sanctuary, a battleground, and a museum to one of the most iconic artists of the 20th century. Frida was the third of four daughters born to Guillermo Kahlo, a German-Hungarian photographer, and Matilda Calderon, a devout Catholic of indigenous and Spanish descent. Her parents were opposites: Guillermo, reserved and intellectual; Matilda, religious and emotionally distant. Frida would inherit her father's introspection and artistic eye, but also her mother's fierce resilience. As a child, Frida was imaginative, outspoken, and bold. She read voraciously and asked questions most adults didn't want to answer. But at the age of 6, she contracted polio, which left her right leg thinner and weaker than the other. A physical difference she tried to mask with long skirts, but never allowed to limit her spirit. The illness left her bedridden for months and isolated from other children. During this time, she grew close to her father, who encouraged her to exercise, ride bicycles, and stay mentally sharp. Unlike most girls of her time, Frida didn't aspire to become a wife or a homemaker. Her goal? To become a doctor. She enrolled in the prestigious National Preparatory School in Mexico City at age 15, one of only a handful of girls accepted. There she stood out not just for her intelligence, but for her rebellious wit, radical thinking, and unique sense of style. She joined a group of young intellectuals known as the Cachuchas, who debated philosophy, literature, and politics. Frida was drawn to revolution, to ideas that challenged tradition. But even in those early years, before the bus crash that would define her body, and before the fame that would define her legacy, Frida Kahlo was already painting herself into the world with sharp edges, unapologetic ideas, and an identity too big to fit inside anyone else's expectations. She wasn't just growing up in Coyoacán, she was preparing to remake herself entirely. On September 17, 1925, Frida Kahlo's life was split in two, the girl she had been and the woman she was forced to become. That afternoon, she boarded a wooden bus with her boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Arias, after school. They were laughing, teasing each other, and probably arguing. Frida never did anything halfway. But moments later, the bus collided with a streetcar, and in an instant, her future unraveled into pain, metal, and silence. The crash was horrific. The streetcar crushed the bus against a wall, splintering wood and flinging passengers. Frida was impaled by an iron handrail. It entered her left hip and exited through her pelvis. Her spinal column fractured in 3 places. Her right leg shattered, her foot dislocated, collarbone and ribs broke. Her shoulder was dislocated. Her abdomen was pierced. She was just 18 years old. A man covered her with a borrowed overcoat. Someone else noticed her body was sparkling, not from blood, but from the gold powder she had been carrying in a pouch. It had exploded on impact, dusting her broken form in what looked like glittering ash. Frida was taken to the Red Cross Hospital and underwent numerous surgeries over the following months. She spent weeks in a body cast, flat on her back, immobile, writhing with infection and uncertainty. The future she'd imagined of becoming a doctor slipped further away with every passing day. But in that stillness, something began to stir. Her father gave her brushes. Her mother rigged a special easel to hang above her bed. A mirror was placed on the canopy so she could see herself. And there, lying in plaster and agony, Frida began to paint, first out of boredom, then out of obsession. Her first subjects were her own reflection, because she was all she had. But what emerged wasn't vanity. It was survival. The crash had broken her physically, but it also opened a door into her own mind, her own body, and eventually into the surreal language of pain and identity that would define her art. The girl who wanted to heal others now began healing herself, one brushstroke at a time. As Frida Kahlo lay encased in plaster and steel, a body fighting itself with every breath, she began to paint. What started as a form of therapy soon became a language, and that language was deeply personal, brutally honest, and often hard to look at, which was precisely the point. Frida didn't paint pretty flowers or polite landscapes. She painted pain, her pain, physical, emotional, and existential. Her first subjects were self-portraits, not because she was vain, but because, as she famously said, "I paint myself because I'm so often alone and because I am the subject I know best." Her early works were small in scale, painted on tin or wood panels, inspired by Mexican retablos, devotional paintings meant to tell stories of suffering and miracles. Frida turned this tradition inward. Her body became the canvas. Her emotions became the altar. She painted herself as split, as pierced, as bleeding. In one painting, she's impaled by nails, like a modern-day martyr. In another, she floats in a barren landscape, tethered to a broken column, a metaphor for her shattered spine. She painted herself weeping, fractured, decapitated, and bare, but never passive, always watching. Her pain was not sanitized. She painted the ugliness of trauma with beauty, defiance, and even humor. Each piece was a reclamation of her body, her experience, and her identity as a woman in a world that often tried to define her. But Frida wasn't just telling her story. She was inventing a new kind of visual narrative, one that blended Mexican folk art, surrealism, medical illustration, and symbolism. Her paintings became dreamlike autopsies of her soul, framed in color, culture, and myth. By the time she recovered enough to walk again, albeit painfully, Frida was no longer the girl who had wanted to be a doctor. She was an artist, and her art was unlike anything anyone had seen. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it into a source of creation. Frida Kahlo didn't just paint her pain, she made the world look at it, and in doing so, she turned suffering into a sacred act of self-expression in 1928, still recovering, still painting, just 21 years old. Frida Kahlo met the man who would become the most profound and turbulent relationship of her life, Diego Rivera. He was 20 years her senior, already Mexico's most famous painter. Massive in both stature and presence, Rivera was a giant of Mexican muralism, known for his sweeping, politically charged frescoes that told the story of the Mexican people. Frida had seen his work before. She admired it, but now she wanted his opinion of her work. She brought her paintings to him at the Ministry of Education, interrupting his scaffold work to ask bluntly, "Do I have talent?" Diego took one look and said yes, and not just out of kindness. He recognized in her something rare, an unfiltered voice, raw and unpretentious, full of rage, irony, pain, and beauty. They began a relationship that was as consuming as it was creative, Frida once said. "I suffered 2 accidents in my life, one in which a streetcar knocked me down. The other was Diego." They married in 1929, an odd pairing to outsiders. Diego, massive, unfaithful, politically famous. Frida, sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, already walking with a cane. Her parents called it a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their bond was passionate but chaotic. Diego supported her art and encouraged her growth as a painter, but he was also endlessly unfaithful, even with Frida's own sister, Cristina. Frida was devastated, and in return she took lovers of her own, both men and women, including rumored affairs with Leon Trotsky and painter Georgia O'Keeffe. They divorced in 1939, then remarried a year later with different terms. This time, Frida would keep her autonomy, her home, her money, her name. Their second marriage was less about traditional love and more about creative partnership and mutual understanding. Despite the betrayals and the heartbreak, Diego remained a constant force in Frida's life. He challenged her. He wounded her, but he also believed in her as an artist, as a revolutionary, and as a woman who could redefine what painting could be. Together they were not peaceful, but they were legendary. In the 1930s, Frida Kahlo followed Diego Rivera on a journey north to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York as he completed high-profile mural commissions. These years abroad brought her face to face with American industrialism, wealth, and the contradictions of capitalism, and they left her with deep political discomfort. Frida was a proud Mexican nationalist, a committed communist, and an admirer of indigenous traditions. The opulence she witnessed in the United States, especially while the Great Depression ravaged much of the country, only deepened her sense of disillusionment. In letters home, she mocked the culture's materialism and obsession with appearances. She missed the grit, color, and contradiction of Mexico. While Diego painted enormous murals on factory walls, Frida began to paint smaller, quieter revolutions, deeply personal works on tin and canvas. Her style solidified sharp, surreal, emotional, and intimate. It was during this time that she produced some of her most iconic self-portraits. Frida didn't just paint herself for vanity, she painted herself to survive. Her identity became her landscape. With her body constantly in pain from her accident, multiple surgeries, and a failed pregnancy in Detroit, she turned inward. Her portraits showed her bleeding, fragmented, exposed. Yet her face was always calm, always direct, unapologetic. One of her most powerful works, Henry Ford Hospital, shows her lying on a hospital bed, crying, surrounded by floating symbols of loss. A fetus, a snail. Medical equipment, a cracked pelvis. It was raw, graphic, and deeply emotional. a canvas that bled with truth. Back in Mexico, Frida immersed herself in leftist politics. She and Diego welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home while he lived in exile. Frida wore Tehuana dresses, traditional indigenous garments, not just as fashion, but as a political and cultural statement. Her art was never disconnected from her beliefs. Her identity, her body, and her ideology all intertwined in her work. While Rivera was painting murals of revolution, Frida painted its human cost, the body in pieces, the mind on fire, and the self always staring back. In exile and in illness, she became not just a painter of pain, but a painter of resistance. When Frida Kahlo returned to Mexico in the late 1930s, she was no longer just Diego Rivera's wife. She had become something else entirely, a force, an artist whose work radiated with raw honesty, surreal symbolism, and cultural identity. Back in her homeland, she stepped fully into herself. Her Casa Azul in Coyoacán became a sanctuary of color and contradiction. Bright cobalt walls, yellow trim, Aztec statues in the garden, monkeys and parrots wandering freely. The house was a living extension of Frida's imagination. It was a blend of tradition and rebellion, elegance and earth. Here she surrounded herself with pre-Columbian artifacts, ex-votos, folk art, and revolutionary books. She wore bold Tijuana dresses, wove flowers into her hair, and painted amid the scent of copal incense and the sounds of mariachi on the street outside. This period marked an explosion of creativity. Her paintings became more intricate, more symbolic, and more political works like the two Fridas revealed the divided self, one in European dress with a bleeding heart, the other in indigenous clothing, strong and composed. It was Frida's visual autobiography, a portrait of love, loss, and heritage. In 1939, she exhibited her work in Paris, where artists like Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky praised her fiercely original style. But even among the surrealists, Frida stood apart. When André Breton tried to label her as one of their own, she pushed back. They thought I was a surrealist, she said. But I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality. She painted Mexico, not the romantic postcard version, but the living, breathing country she adored. Her work pulsed with symbolism, skeletons, hummingbirds, hearts, thorns, corn, and blood. She honored the indigenous roots of her homeland while unmasking the violence of its past and present. But even as her artistic voice grew stronger, her health continued to decline. Multiple surgeries, infections, and chronic pain became daily realities. Still, she painted through it, propped up in bed, torso bound in corsets, fingers clenched around a brush. Frida had returned to Mexico not to rest, but to reclaim her power through paint, through politics, and through her fearless embrace of the self. As the 1940s wore on, Frida Kahlo's body continued to betray her. Her spine was deteriorating. Her right leg was constantly infected. She underwent more than 30 surgeries in her lifetime, often in grueling succession. At times, she was bedridden for months, encased in body casts or immobilized by traction devices that stretched her bones apart. But still she painted. Each canvas during these years became both a release and an act of resistance. Her works grew darker, more defiant. She painted with a clarity sharpened by pain, refusing to hide behind metaphor. In the broken column, she presents herself split down the middle, her body pierced with nails. A cracked ionic column replacing her spine. Yet her face is stoic, her gaze unflinching. Pain for Frida was no longer just a subject. It was her companion, her antagonist, her muse. Her political voice also grew louder. She joined the Mexican Communist Party, marched in demonstrations, wrote fiery letters, and called out imperialism and injustice when her health no longer allowed her to walk. She appeared at protests in a wheelchair, definitely holding signs and shouting slogans. In 1953, Frida was given her first solo exhibition in Mexico, a long overdue celebration of her art. But her health was so fragile, doctors told her she couldn't attend. So she did what only Frida would do. She arrived by ambulance, carried in on a stretcher, and placed in the center of the gallery on her hospital bed, dressed in traditional finery. Surrounded by her own work, she greeted guests with tequila, laughter, and that fire still burning in her eyes. Her final paintings were both childlike and harrowing. In Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick, she painted herself wearing a steel corset, cradled by the hands of Marx, casting away symbols of oppression. Her last known work was a still life of sliced watermelons, one piece bearing the words, Viva la vida, long live life. Even in the face of death, she remained defiant, joyful, and political. Frida Kahlo's last portraits weren't just self-portraits. They were acts of revolution, painted in pain, but always signed with life. On July 13, 1954, at the age of 47, Frida Kahlo died in the same place she had been born, La Casa Azul in Coyoacán. The official cause was listed as a pulmonary embolism, but those closest to her whispered of something deeper. She had been ill, yes, but also exhausted by pain, by surgeries, by the long war with her own body. Just days before, she had attended a political protest against the CIA-led coup in Guatemala. Weak and wheelchair-bound, she insisted on going, her clenched fist raised in the air. Revolution remained her final heartbeat. Her last diary entry was brief, but piercing. I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return. Frida's funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Arts, Mexico's most prestigious cultural institution. Her body, draped in the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, was watched over by friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries. Diego Rivera was inconsolable. He called her the greatest love of his life, even as his betrayals had nearly broken her. But in the years that followed her death, something extraordinary happened. Frida Kahlo refused to disappear. At first, her name was whispered only in art circles. Her works weren't easy to categorize, too political for surrealists, too surreal for traditionalists. But slowly, her image, her story, and her defiance began to resonate through the 1970s and 1980s. As feminist scholars and activists reclaimed forgotten voices, Frida's became louder. She wasn't just a painter anymore. She was a symbol of pain turned into beauty, of feminism born through resistance, of Mexican identity celebrated without apology, of queerness, disability, revolution, and authenticity. Her face, unibrow, gaze, flowers in her hair, became iconic. Her home became a museum, her diary became a sacred text, and her paintings now hang in the world's greatest museums. Frida Kahlo had lived much of her life in Diego's shadow, but in death, she stepped forward. She didn't just leave behind paintings. She left behind a mirror and dared us all to look, not with pity, not with fear, but with fire. Today, Frida Kahlo's face is everywhere. Printed on t-shirts, painted on murals, turned into dolls, memes, posters, and icons. Her signature unibrow, her flower-crowned hair, her direct gaze, all instantly recognizable. But what makes her legacy powerful isn't just that people know her face, it's that they recognize the truth behind it. Frida didn't try to be flawless. She didn't fit into boxes. She wasn't conventional. And she didn't care to be. In a world that demands perfection, she gave us realness. Raw, messy, vibrant, angry, joyful, contradictory realness. She celebrated what made her different, her disability, her queerness, her politics, her culture, and turned it into art that transcended borders and decades. She's become more than an artist. She's a global symbol of defiance, feminism, and cultural pride, and creative resistance. For queer communities, she's a fearless bisexual icon who lived openly and unapologetically in a time that demanded silence. For women, she's a reminder that power doesn't require permission. For disabled artists, she's proof that pain can fuel the brush, not stop it. And for Mexico, she's a daughter reclaimed, fierce folkloric, and forever part of the national soul. Her paintings, once dismissed as too strange or too personal, are now among the most revered in the world. Works like the two Fridas, self-portrait with thorn necklace and hummingbird, and the broken column aren't just seen. They're felt deeply by anyone who has ever suffered and needed to turn that suffering into something sacred. She lived in the margins and turned them into center stage. She embraced contradiction, a communist who wore gold, a woman betrayed, who loved again, a body in pieces with a soul unbreakable. And through it all, she painted not just with color, but with conviction. Frida Kahlo never asked to be a symbol. She simply told the truth about herself, and in doing so, told the truth for millions of others who had never seen themselves reflected in art before. Now, when we see her face, we see courage, we see color, we see resistance. We see freedom not gone, but immortal. When you think of medieval life, you might imagine jousting knights, grand feasts, and merry fairs. But for the average peasant, winter was less about merriment and more about how do we not die tonight. It wasn't just a season. It was a test of endurance that came around every year, like an especially cruel teacher who didn't believe in second chances. Picture this. You're living in a tiny mud and stick hut with walls so thin you could probably hear a bird sneeze from outside. No insulation, no windows, unless you count a small hole stuffed with animal skin. And definitely no thermostat wars with your siblings. The inside temperature of your home was usually just a polite couple of degrees above whatever the weather was doing outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was politely, slightly less freezing inside. Congratulations. Nights were the worst. Darkness swallowed everything. The wind howled like an angry ghost, and the fire in the hearth sputtered pathetically, doing its best, but mostly just roasting the toes of whoever was sitting closest. If you were on the other side of the room, sorry, you might as well have been camping outside with worse snacks. Clothing wasn't much help either. Peasants didn't own fancy fur coats or goose-down blankets. You had a couple of rough-spun wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled suspiciously of goat, and a hope that layering them would turn you into some kind of human onion. Spoiler. It didn't really work. And forget about snuggling under soft quilts. Beds were often nothing more than sacks stuffed with hay or straw, maybe with a few old rushes thrown in for good measure. And bonus, some fleas for extra company. Luxury. Their name is medieval peasant life. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and general freezing to death were constant risks, especially for young children and the elderly. Every morning that you woke up still breathing was considered a minor miracle and honestly worth celebrating, maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yes, surviving a medieval winter wasn't about comfort. It was about gritting your teeth, piling on every piece of cloth you owned, huddling with your livestock, and praying you didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And the real adventure, it was just beginning. If you think your apartment is drafty because the window doesn't close properly, medieval peasants would like a word. Their homes weren't just drafty. They were basically very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Most peasant houses were what historians politely call wattle and daub construction. Translation, sticks crisscrossed like a giant basket, smeared with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. They weren't trying to be gross. Dung was a cheap, sticky insulator. Plus, it was always readily available, shall we say. These walls, no matter how lovingly smeared, didn't stand much chance against a proper winter storm. The cold wind found every crack, every gap, and gleefully danced its way into the one-room homes, swirling around and making sure you never got too comfortable. Privacy? Absolutely not. Warmth? Not really. Character building? Definitely. And then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs looked picturesque, sure, but after a few months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally let in the local wildlife. Nothing says pleasant evening like a squirrel dropping onto your dinner. Windows, if they existed at all, were laughably tiny, and usually covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane in peasants. They were just happy if the wind didn't rip the cowhide right off the wall mid-blizzard. To make matters worse, floors were often just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, mud seeped up through the ground, so technically you could say they had indoor water features. Not that they appreciated it. In winter, every step inside your own home could feel like trudging across a frozen marsh. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from inside. It was a three-dimensional assault on your body heat. But medieval peasants weren't the type to whine. They packed gaps with moss, jammed old rags into the worst drafts, and huddled close to each other, human insulation at its finest, creativity. Stubbornness and a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the walls were often the only things standing between them and becoming medieval popsicles. Because if your house was falling apart and your best protection against the elements involved mud and goat hair, well, at least you could laugh about it. Sort of. If your teeth weren't chattering too hard. As if the freezing air wasn't enough, medieval peasants also had to battle a silent enemy rising from below. The frozen ground itself. Floors weren't really floors back then. They were just slightly flatter patches of earth inside your home. Maybe if you were lucky, someone had thrown down some straw or old rushes to give you the illusion of comfort. But make no mistake, you were sleeping one insulted back away from the cold, hard dirt. And oh, that cold was relentless. It seeped up from the earth like an evil little ghost, worming its way through the straw into your bones and straight into your very soul. If you dropped anything onto the floor during a winter night, congratulations, it was now part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this grim battle in a few ways. One method was layering thick mats of straw across the floor. If you could afford it, or more realistically, if you could steal enough of it from your neighbor's field without getting caught. You might have a decent insulating barrier, but straw flattened fast, got moldy even faster, and added an extra crunchy soundtrack to your already miserable nights. Some homes layered dried rushes onto the dirt instead. Every so often they would throw fresh rushes on top without cleaning out the old ones. Over time, this created a fascinating ecosystem of decomposing plants, fleas, and whatever mystery creatures decided to move in. It was basically medieval carpet padding. If your carpet was alive, slightly damp, and smelled like a wet dog bed, for those who had them, didn't solve much. They were usually little more than wooden frames packed with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of cozy mattresses, you had poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did little against the cold radiating from below. Tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was a desperate, upward dance to keep blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of your body. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the icy ground so much as learn to live uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about waking up with all your toes still attached. And if you could pull that off, hey, you were doing better than most. If medieval homes had a single hero during winter, it wasn't the roof or the walls, or even the brave layers of dirt and dung insulation. It was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn fire pit that served as the only real defense against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval life. At the center of nearly every peasant home was a simple fire. No fireplace with a fancy stone mantel, no neat chimney sweeping the smoke skyward instead. You had a basic pit or pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly becoming a ham. That's right, most homes didn't even have chimneys. Smoke just kind of did its best. It drifted out through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or right into your lungs if it was feeling lazy that evening. It wasn't ideal for breathing or your overall lifespan. But on the bright side, it did a great job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted guests. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in smoke 24/7? The hearth wasn't just about warmth either. It was the kitchen, the light source, and sometimes even the medieval version of a television. People sat around the fire telling stories, gossiping, or just staring into the flames because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do after sunset. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just a nice idea, it was mandatory. Letting the fire die out at night was like putting up a sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in winter wasn't as easy as striking a match. You had to work with flint, steel, kindling, and more prayers than you'd ever offered before. Everyone in the family had a duty, stoking the flames, watching the embers, adding peat sticks. Or, if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant battle between human persistence and the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you out. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire. But in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting the fire go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And in the dead of winter, restarting a fire from scratch wasn't just inconvenient. It could be deadly. Matches didn't exist yet. Lighters. Dream on. Rekindling a fire meant striking flint and steel together, praying for a single precious spark, and then coddling that spark with tender love and whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago. Imagine trying to do all this in the freezing dark, half asleep with frozen fingers. Now add a hungry wolf howling in the distance for extra motivation. So, peasants got smart. They banked the fire. No, not in a cozy savings account. Banking meant carefully burying the embers under a mound of ash right before bed. The ash acted like a blanket, insulating the glowing coals and keeping them alive just barely until morning. If you did it right, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile a little, add fresh wood, and voila, fire without the frostbite. But if you did it wrong, well, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder and a whole lot grumpier. Fire banking was an art passed down from parent to child like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their own little secrets. Some said to use dry ash only. Others insisted a bit of dampness was key. Some packed the embers tight, others let them breathe. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better fire banking method. It was the ancient version of arguing over barbecue techniques, just with slightly higher survival stakes. Sometimes banking the fire wasn't enough. A howling wind might sneak through a crack and snuff it out anyway, or a clumsy sheet might stumble into the hearth. Yes, it happened. That's why some families took turns getting up in the night to check the coals, basically the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat. In the end, fire banking was less about mastering nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth. And if you woke up to even a single surviving ember, that was your victory right there, and enough to face another day of battling the cold. In medieval times, the phrase "the more the merrier" wasn't just about parties. It was a winter survival tactic. When the fire sputtered and the freezing winds whistled through every crack, there was one surefire source of warmth for each other. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, neighbors, livestock, and possibly a very confused goose, so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a concept. On the coldest nights, the goal wasn't comfort. They didn't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire households piled into the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find, and formed what could best be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. Younger kids squeezed in between parents, grandparents snuggled under the outer layers, and if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, well, there was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle, where body heat radiated from all sides. If you were unlucky, you were on edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a meat locker, and more to the person who moved too much during the night. You shift once to get comfortable, and suddenly you've knocked Aunt Maud into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations, you're now the family villain. Sometimes even bedding was shared, a communal straw mattress that slowly flattened under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, you stop being picky. Body heat wasn't just nice, it was strategic. Some medieval guides even recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the group, like human shields against the cold. Babies and frail elders were tucked deep in the center, treated like the precious little heat generators they were. This wasn't just about survival, though. Over time, it became part of daily life, part of family bonding. Long winter nights huddled together led to storytelling, singing, and undoubtedly, some very interesting conversations muffled under a shared wool blanket. So next time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. If you thought modern roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens. Basically anything with a pulse and a little bit of body heat. Bringing animals indoors wasn't just a quirky village tradition. It was vital for survival. Livestock generated warmth, and in a poorly insulated hovel where the wind howled louder than your stomach, every little degree mattered. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you, it was slightly less likely to get stolen by a neighbor in the dead of night. Two birds, one stinky stone. At night, the house became a chaotic living furnace. Chickens nested in corners, pigs snorted near the hearth, and cows lounged luxuriously against the walls, chewing cud like they paid rent. It wasn't glamorous. Far from it. If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower, imagine that. But it's a cow. It's winter, and there's literally nowhere else to go. The smells are legendary by springtime. The perfume of a shared winter was something fierce. You didn't need to light a candle. Your nostrils were already on a wild ride, but medieval peasants developed a selective nose. They didn't complain much because they knew one uncomfortable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes in the morning. Certain animals even had prime spots. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, usually took center stage near the family. Goats were allowed closer in for their warmth, and because goats, being goats, would find a way inside anyway. Chickens roost in rafters or old baskets, and pigs, well, pigs didn't care. They plopped down wherever they pleased, probably right in the middle of the floor. Of course, sharing your bedroom with livestock wasn't without hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair makes a good perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Still, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple math. Cold kills and cows cuddle, whether they want to or not. In the battle against winter's icy fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breathes was often the deciding factor between life and death. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good. It was about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trends. They were layering up like they were preparing for battle against the Grim Reaper himself. The rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it. Sometimes all at once. First, the basic undertunic, a scratchy, probably not too clean linen shirt. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic, then another, if you had it. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cloak draped over your shoulders, and if you were really lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on top like a prize trophy. Congratulations, you are now approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or old rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still bites through, well, you just added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe. And forget about washing all these layers. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, smashing through the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry. If it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt cycle. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Interestingly, the dirt and grease buildup had a bonus feature: insulation. That grimy layer locked in body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were prized treasures. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between making it through the night or waking up with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often homemade from whatever scraps of leather or fabric people could scrounge, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than anything fashionable. Children were especially swaddled until they resembled overstuffed turnips, waddling awkwardly around the house. The goal was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style. Elegance. Never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex. So the next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, just remember medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags and counting themselves lucky for it. In the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't just something you scrubbed off. It was practically a survival tool, as it turns out. Getting grimy wasn't a sign you'd given up on life. It was tactical, strategic, dare we say, genius. See, winter posed a very specific problem. Heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. They were breathable, sure, But when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt came in. As peasants trudged through day after day without washing their clothing, layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just smelly as sure. You smelled like a goat who lost a bet. But guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval folks believed that washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective holy filth barrier intact. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for serious occasions, like when the bishop showed up, or maybe right before you died. Adding to the strategy, peasants layered their clothes without changing the ones underneath. You just threw your new layer on top of last month's. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks, every stain telling the heroic story of that one time I slipped in the mud but didn't die. To outside observers, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they had completely given up on hygiene. But the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't a failure. It was fashionable. It was a function. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you, my friend, were winning at life. If you thought medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush feather beds with embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was a bit more rustic. And by rustic, I mean let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best beds in the medieval peasant world. Were usually a rough wooden frame, if you could afford one, covered with a big sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, no five-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. Every toss and turn in the night brought a delightful soundtrack, crinkling straw, and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stalk. Some peasants even skipped the wooden frame altogether and just threw the straw straight onto the dirt floor, creating a luxurious ground-level sleeping experience that modern influences would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber. The straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. Over time, the straw flattened, grew moldy, attracted bugs, and generally turned into a biological hazard zone. Changing the straw was a big event, usually done a few times a year if you were diligent, or whenever your bed started actively moving without your permission. Rushes were a popular alternative. These long grasses were spread thick on the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary, to mask the overwhelming odor livestock aroma of daily life. Fresh rushes smelled lovely for about a day after that. They became part of the muddy, trampled landscape inside the house, blending seamlessly with dirt, food scraps, and whatever else wandered in. And let's not forget the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other charming critters loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants did. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations. You were living the authentic medieval experience, despite the hardships. These humble beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw provided a crucial insulating layer against the frozen earth, and clumping together atop them created pockets of shared body heat, medieval central heating at its finest. So next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress, just remember somewhere out there a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth and saying it must be nice. When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just a nuisance, they're personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold from the outside, they fought it from inside their own homes, armed with nothing but whatever they could cram into the cracks. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Walls warped, mud crumbled, thatch sagged. The cold seemed to find new places to sneak in every night, like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. Sealing up the house became an art form. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it was jammed into a hole somewhere. Some particularly determined souls daubed extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Imagine standing there in freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine. This is luxury." Because in a way, it was. Roof leaks were another battlefield. Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof. Especially after a few seasons of rain and snow, peasants would plug holes in the roof with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds, or, in moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Every home eventually started to look like a slightly sad patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway through. Doors, windows. If you had them, you were lucky. But even then, they were little more than wood planks hung by iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window holes were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block out the worst drafts and add a bonus aroma of mystery meat to the living space. Every night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless, sneaky cold. One minute you were warm. The next minute, a sudden gust would find the one spot you missed, slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom. Yet somehow, through cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept, slightly frozen as a permanent state of being, medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and muddled their way through the worst winters nature could throw at them, one muddy handful at a time. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even try to pretend everyone's sleeping at once. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that today would make any military commander proud: sleeping in shifts. It wasn't some grand, organized system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more desperate. Half the household stayed awake, tending to the fire and patching up stray drafts, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and hay, trying to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep. The fire needed constant attention. Left alone, it would die down, and restarting it, remember, was about as easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance. So someone had to be on Ember Patrol. And since no one wanted to get up once they were finally warmish, families rotated shifts. You dozed for a few hours, got elbowed awake, then stumbled over to the hearth to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life while trying not to step on a goat. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no late night snacks, and certainly no 5 more minute snooze buttons. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing resentment toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. Children old enough to hold a stick were pressed into service, learning early that in winter everyone pulled their weight or froze trying. Grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire longer, both because of their experience and, frankly, because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a monumental event. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck. With people moving about, animals rustling, wind battering the walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who accidentally rolled over too hard, getting quality rest was a miracle. Yet despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant that there was always a set of eyes and cold, begrudging hands, ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So next time you grumble about waking up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant squinting into a smoking fire at 3 a.m., wondering if toes were really that important after all. You know it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the freezing air with cloaks, fires, and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The problem was simple. Deep, open-mouthed breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs. In a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say, "Hail Mary," that was a risk nobody wanted to take. So, peasants learned the art of what you might call survival breathing. Instead of sucking in huge gulps of air like they'd just run a marathon, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and most importantly, through the nose. The idea was to gently warm the incoming air a bit before it hit their lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing yourself into the grave by February. If you accidentally took a big mouthful of cold air, congratulations, you just bought yourself a ticket to a week of hacking up bits of what felt like your soul. With no doctor's insight and grandma treating you with hot onion tea and firm prayers, Some people even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift breath warmer barrier. Of course, this also meant you ended up with a damp, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging to your mouth by morning. But hey, it beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these tricks early on. Parents would scold little ones for panting like dogs. Indoors during the cold months, and honestly, between strict breathing lessons, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were character building on a whole different level. At night, tucked into straw bedding under piles of cloaks, and next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an art form, slow, steady, nose only, and as minimal as humanly possible. Like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes in the grand survival playbook. It wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants endured another night in the long, relentless war against winter. In the endless battle against medieval winter, peasants discovered an unlikely secret weapon: a full stomach. Turns out one of the best ways to fight off the cold wasn't another scratchy wool cloak. It was stuffing yourself with something hearty and heavy right before bed. Calories meant warmth. The more your body had to digest, the more it heated itself up doing the work. It's basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a heavy meal, generate internal heat, and maybe, just maybe, survive until morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So what did medieval peasants pile onto their plates before a long, freezing night? Think thick stews, heavy with root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains were lifesavers, too. Oat porridge, barley gruel, or dense, chewy rye bread. If you were especially lucky, say after a festival day or a generous slaughter, you might even get a hunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense. No delicate presentation, no artisanal garnishes. It was one enormous, vaguely brown meal designed to sit in your gut like a friendly brick, slowly burning through the night and keeping you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about eating a lot, it was about eating smart. Foods that took longer to digest provided a slow, steady trickle of warmth. Fatty foods were particularly prized not just for the energy they provided, but because fat burns slower than lean meat. A belly full of stew, bread, and a questionable amount of lard. Peak medieval winter luxury. Parents made sure even the pickiest children ate heartily. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips, or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you missed the turnips. Harsh but effective parenting. Medieval style, of course. Heavy nighttime eating came with its own hazards. You might be warmer, but you were also risking a night of vivid, bizarre dreams, fueled by a stomach, trying desperately to process an entire field's worth of cabbages. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Because in the end, peasants weren't aiming for a Michelin star meal. They were aiming to survive. And if that meant going to bed full, bloated, and breathing gently through your nose next to a steaming cow, that was just another night in the ongoing quest to see another frosty sunrise. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to get creative if they wanted a little extra warmth at bedtime. And that's how the humble hay box and the ever-glamorous heated stone became winter's unsung heroes. Let's start with the hay box. It sounds rustic, and it absolutely was, but the idea was pure genius. Peasants would take a sturdy wooden box, line it thickly with hay, and use it to store food that had been cooked earlier, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge, toss it into the hay box, cover it up, and it stays hot enough for a late-night snack without needing to risk reigniting the fire. Medieval slow cookers, basically. But peasants didn't just stop at food. They realized if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap the heat from something even better. Rocks enter the era of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, someone, probably whichever unlucky child lost the family argument, would grab a flat stone and chuck it into the heart of the hearth fire. After roasting it until it was nearly too hot to touch, a fine line between helpful and third-degree burn, they'd fish it out using a stick or some old tongs. The stone, still radiating blissful warmth, would be carefully wrapped in rags, tucked into an old piece of cloth or jammed into a clay pot. then slipped under the hay in the mattress or down at the foot of the bed. A medieval heating pad ready to do battle against the frozen earth. Of course, there were risks. If you didn't wrap the stone properly, congratulations, you now had a small, localized house fire. And if you dropped it on your foot, well, let's just say winter injuries weren't always caused by slipping on ice, but when everything went right, that stone provided precious, comforting warmth that could last for hours. It wasn't luxurious, but when you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury was defined as not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. In the grand arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock tucked into some hay might not sound glamorous, but for peasants clinging to whatever heat they could find, it was a tiny miracle in a medieval peasant home. The hearth wasn't just where you cooked dinner. It was practically a family member. A temperamental, smoky, sometimes uncooperative family member, sure, but still absolutely essential to survival, especially when it came time to sleep. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. That meant sleeping arrangements were less about personal preference and more about strategic positioning of infants, the elderly. And anyone sick or frail got first dibs on prime hearth real estate. Parents, older kids, and sturdier adults fanned out from there like human insulation layers. Being assigned a spot close to the fire wasn't just kindness, it was basic survival math. Babies were fragile heat generators, and elders were precious repositories of family knowledge. And let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them with prime warmth was non-negotiable. But it wasn't all cozy toasting by the flames. Too close, and you risked waking up with your hair singed or your cloak smoldering suspiciously. Too far, and you were basically camping in an icebox. It was a delicate dance. Stay near enough to bask in the fire's glow, but not so near that you had to explain to your neighbor why you now looked like a half-cooked roast. The fire also didn't spread warmth evenly. It mostly roasted the people directly in front of it, while everyone else fought over the narrow cone of heat like cold lizards jostling for a sunbeam. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one blissfully warm side, and one side frozen so solid you could probably knock on it. Pets and livestock, of course, muscled in too. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, tail wagging dangerously close to open flame. Chickens sometimes perched perilously on hearthstones, plucking softly into the night like tiny, feathery guardians of warmth. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of glowing embers was a tiny promise. You're still alive. You're still warm for now. And so peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled by the fire's pops and hisses, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't comfortable. But it was life, clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals. In the medieval world, no one survived winter alone unless they wanted to become a very stylish frozen statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family affair. It was a village project, a messy, muddy, loud collaboration where everyone's warmth and life depended on everyone else. The peasants knew that in the dead of winter, a strong fire and a pile of hay could only do so much. If your neighbor's house went dark, you noticed. If the smoke from Old Tom's hearth suddenly stopped curling into the sky, someone went to check. And not just because Tom owed you a chicken, though that might be part of it, but because community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, often the young or the elderly who couldn't work the fields but could keep an eye on who were coughing too hard, who hadn't come to barter at the market in a few days, or whose home looked a little too still in the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of neighborhood patrol, minus the reflective vest, plus a lot more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was a near emergency. A good neighbor would rush over with a glowing coal bundled in rags. Or better yet, invite them into their own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing an extra 4 bodies into an already cramped space, but it was better than finding frozen friends come spring thaw. Communal food stores played a role too. During especially brutal winters, villages sometimes pooled their last salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables. It was a grim charity. No one had much, but a few communal meals could be the difference between staggering into spring or not. Even children understood the stakes. They helped deliver wood, shared embers, and ran urgent messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter came knocking. Sure, medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds happened, disputes over land, goats, or who borrowed whose good cooking pot never really went away. But when the nights grew deadly cold, old grudges were often quietly shelved. After all, a rival was still worth saving, because tomorrow it might be you needing rescue. In the icy heart of winter, the village became one big, stubborn family, sometimes dysfunctional, often hilarious, always fiercely determined to survive together. One muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. When medieval peasants faced the merciless cold of winter, they didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke the fire. They prayed a lot. Because when the wind howled like wolves outside your paper-thin walls and the fire shrank into sullen embers, you wanted every possible advantage, including a little divine intervention. Faith wasn't just a Sunday affair back then. It was woven into every frozen breath. Before crawling under layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together, offering up hurried prayers to keep the fire burning, the roof intact, and their toes attached by morning. Saints became more than distant holy figures. They were winter's frontline defense. Saint Blaise, for instance, was called upon to protect against throat ailments, not a minor concern when one mouthful of icy air could land you coughing up your soul. Saint Nicholas wasn't just the jolly gift giver of later legend. He was also asked to protect households from sudden ruin during the lean, deadly months. Superstitions wrapped themselves snugly around daily survival. Some families sprinkled a little holy water near the hearth before sleeping, hoping it would protect against evil spirits, or at the very least, mischievous drafts. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, pleading for warmth and luck to find their way inside. Candles played a role, too. Special vigil candles, often blessed by the local priest or the most pious old woman in the village, were sometimes kept burning throughout the night, a flickering plea against the cold darkness clawing at the walls. And of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without a few promises. Dear Lord, if you just get us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't some abstract comfort. It was a daily, urgent conversation. The peasants weren't asking for luxury, just survival. A little heat, a little food, and one more day to muddle through until spring broke the frozen grip on their tiny villages. It was simple, raw hope whispered into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers and tucked under itchy blankets that somehow carried them through the endless, merciless nights of winter. For all the ingenuity, prayers, and stubbornness medieval peasants threw at winter, the truth was chilling. Sometimes it wasn't enough. And when winter won, it didn't just take a few unlucky souls. It took entire families, whole villages, vanishing them into silence beneath a heavy shroud of snow and ice. Some winters were particularly cruel, like the infamous Great Famine winter of 1315, when rains destroyed crops, livestock starved, and freezing temperatures turned an already brutal existence into a slow, grinding disaster. People were so desperate that stories whispered of eating shoe leather bark, and in the most horrifying cases, each other. Failure to keep the fire alive wasn't just an inconvenience, it was often a death sentence. Without the hearth's meager warmth, families huddled together for the final time. Neighbors would sometimes stumble across whole households in spring, bodies still locked in one another's frozen embrace, as if trying to share just a little more heat until the very end. Houses themselves could collapse under the weight of heavy snow or battering ice storms. A roof giving way in the middle of a frozen night wasn't just catastrophic. It was often fatal. Dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg shelter from neighbors wasn't a guarantee either, especially if those neighbors were already stretched to the breaking point. Disease loved the cold, too. Starvation weakened the body, and cramped, smoky homes turned into breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other deadly infections. A simple cough in December could easily be a funeral by January. And then there was the quiet horror. Frostbite. Fingers, toes, even ears blackened and died while still attached to their owners. Some villagers survived winters at the cost of their limbs. A grim badge of honor that said I made it through. But winter took a piece of me. Yet what's most haunting isn't just the death, it's the eerie normalcy of it. People accepted that each winter some among them wouldn't see the thaw. Death wasn't unexpected. It was just another neighbor at the door, wrapped in frost, waiting its turn. Even amid the bitter cold and constant threat, medieval peasants pressed on, stubborn, grieving, clinging to life. Because as long as there was one ember left in the hearth, one breath hanging in the frozen air, there was still a fight worth fighting. When we look back at medieval peasants, those muddy, frostbitten survivors of endless winters, it's tempting to see only their hardships. The cracked hands, the frozen toes, the smoke-choked huts. But buried beneath all that struggle is something far more powerful, a legacy of raw, stubborn ingenuity and unbreakable endurance. They didn't have central heating, thermal jackets, or cozy memory foam mattresses. They didn't even have the luxury of assuming they'd survive until spring. But what they did have, and what they left behind, was the blueprint for resilience. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every hand-banked fire, every moss-crammed wall gap was a testament to human creativity under pressure. Faced with impossible odds, they didn't collapse in despair. They adapted. They learned from the land, from each other. And from the bitter lessons carved by each brutal winter, their communities were built on more than shared land. They were built on shared survival. They taught each other to watch over the sick, to pool resources when food ran low, to trust that helping a freezing neighbor today meant someone might help you tomorrow. They lived by the understanding that no one beats winter alone. Their faith, too, was a kind of endurance. They wove prayers into their daily lives, not just out of fear, but out of hope. Fragile, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter. Hope that after 100 dark nights, spring would come again and life would find a way to push through the frozen ground. And somehow it did, because of their sacrifices, because of their unglamorous victories, surviving one more night, one more storm. Future generations thrived. Bit by frozen bit, they pushed humanity forward. Enduring winters, their ancestors could barely survive until warmth and comfort became common expectations instead of distant dreams. Their blood, sweat, and ingenuity are stitched invisibly into the lives we live now. Every cozy blanket, every warm house, every lazy winter evening spent sipping tea under soft lights. All of it is the end result of countless medieval peasants refusing to give in to the cold. So the next time the wind howls outside your double-paned window, maybe spare a thought for them. The nameless, fearless ones who turned shivering survival into a living legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. And Bullen didn't come into the world with a crown on her head. Her armies at her feet. Born around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Bullen, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with powerful family ties. In the grand scheme of Tudor society, Anne's birth barely stirred a ripple. Yet from these modest beginnings, something extraordinary was taking root, a life that would one day tilt the course of English history from an early age, and was set apart not by her wealth, but by her mind. She was clever, spirited, and by all accounts magnetic. Recognizing her potential, her family sent her abroad to the continent, where her education truly began. First, she served Margaret of Austria in the glittering court of the Netherlands, an experience few English girls could dream of. There, Anne absorbed the art of diplomacy, refined manners, and the subtle dance of European politics. But it was in France that Anne's brilliance was truly polished. She spent years in the sophisticated courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, learning the language of influence, elegance, flirtation, wit. While other young women perfected their embroidery and mastered conversation, intrigue, and the art of commanding attention without ever seeming to seek it. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne was something rare, a woman who could rival the sophistication of continental courtiers while carrying the ambition of a rising English house. She wasn't a classic beauty. Even her admirers admitted as much, but she was arresting dark eyes that sparked with intelligence, a quick musical voice, a way of moving that suggested purpose just barely concealed beneath layers of courtly grace. And didn't just enter rooms, she changed their gravity. At a time when a woman's fate was often sealed by birth and marriage, and refused to drift quietly into obscurity, she had seen the power that charm and intellect could wield in foreign courts, and she intended to use that knowledge at home. Anne Boleyn was still a young woman then, clever, ambitious, untested, but history was already beginning to stir around her. The girl who returned to England was no longer just Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was a player in a larger game, one that would soon engulf the crown itself. When Anne Boleyn returned to the English court, she was unlike anyone the nobility had ever seen. In a world full of pale-faced, modest English roses, and was a thunderstorm, electric, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. Her dark hair, bold eyes, and quick, sharp wit set her apart from the gentle, obedient ladies who filled the court of King Henry VIII. At first, she played the role expected of her, a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence flickered like a candle too bright to snuff out. She danced gracefully, spoke French with the ease of a native, and laughed with a confidence few women dare display. Men noticed, women gossiped. The court buzzed quietly about the striking Boleyn girl. It wasn't long before she caught the most dangerous attention of all, the king himself. Henry VIII was no stranger to flirtation. His court was a playground of whispered promises and secret liaisons. But Anne was different. She didn't swoon at his compliments or fall eagerly into his arms like so many others had. She teased. She challenged me. She refused. Henry, a man used to instant adoration, was captivated. The more Anne held him at arm's length, the deeper he fell. Letters passed between them, filled with declarations of love, frustration, longing. Henry offered her the role of royal mistress, the most powerful unofficial position at court, and astonishingly said no. She would not be just another conquest, a forgotten mistress lost to time. If Henry wanted her, he would have to make her his wife. It was a gamble so audacious that it stunned the court. After all, the king was already married. His queen, Catherine, was beloved by the people and fiercely protected by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The church itself would have to be defied for Henry to claim, but Anne didn't flinch. She had lived in the courts of Europe, where queens wielded soft power from behind lace fans and painted smiles. She knew ambition was a dangerous game, but it was a game she intended to win. Standing in the candlelit halls of the English court, Anne Boleyn made her choice not to be merely admired, but to change her destiny and England's forever. What began as an intense flirtation between King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn soon spiraled into a national crisis. Henry wasn't merely besotted. He was obsessed, and in his obsession, he was willing to tear apart everything England had known for centuries. The king's desire to marry and hit a small snag. Namely, he was already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine, dignified and resilient, refused to quietly step aside. She had been Henry's faithful wife for 2 decades, and in the eyes of God and the English people, she was the rightful queen. Divorce wasn't just scandalous, it was almost unthinkable. But Henry was determined. He convinced himself and tried to convince everyone else that his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had once been married to his brother Arthur. Never mind that the Pope had granted special permission for their union years ago. Henry now insisted that his soul was damned unless he annulled the marriage, and for her part, knew better than to appear too eager. She kept herself just out of reach, alternately encouraging Henry's hopes and maintaining her distance. Every glance, every word was measured. She wasn't merely aiming for marriage. She was positioning herself to become Queen of England. The court erupted into whispers and factions. Some noble families eagerly courted Anne's favor, seeing the winds of power shifting. Others clung fiercely to Queen Catherine. Horrified at the idea of and replacing her, diplomats wrote desperate letters back to Rome. Foreign monarchs threatened retaliation. Henry's own advisors shifted uneasily, sensing the ground trembling beneath their feet. As months turned into years, Henry's frustration grew. He bombarded the Pope with petitions, maneuvered his lawyers into finding loopholes, and slowly began to realize that the church would not bend easily. Catherine had powerful allies, including her nephew, Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. Still, Henry pressed on, defying advice, tradition, and increasingly, the law itself. His courtship with Anne had become something far greater than personal desire. It was now a challenge to the very structure of England's political and religious life. Anne wasn't just capturing a king's heart, She was dragging an entire kingdom into uncharted waters. A dangerous game had begun, and there could be no turning back. After nearly 7 agonizing years of maneuvering, scandal, and diplomatic chaos, and Boleyn's gamble paid off. In January 1533, she secretly married Henry VIII. A bold move, given that he was still technically married to Catherine of Aragon in the eyes of the Pope and much of Europe by June, and was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the crowning moment of her life, but the atmosphere was far from universally joyful. The people of London watched with wary eyes. Some cheered, others muttered prayers for Queen Catherine. Many wondered if this new queen, with her French manners and daring spirit, was a blessing or a curse, and entered her queenship not as a beloved figure, but as a storm. Unlike Catherine, who embodied traditional English values of humility and piety, and was dazzling, provocative, and politically savvy, she wore bold colors, commanded the court with sharp intelligence, and made powerful enemies with breathtaking speed. Her position, while seemingly secure, was also terrifyingly precarious. Everything rested on one thing: providing Henry with a male heir, and knew this as keenly as anyone. She was not merely Henry's lover anymore. She was the hope of a dynasty. Early in her pregnancy, Anne and Henry were elated, certain the child would be a boy. But on September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. To Anne's credit, she masked her crushing disappointment with grace, insisting the next child would surely be a son. Henry, however, was less composed. His eyes, once full of adoration, now flickered with doubt. Still, for a time, a star burned brightly. She reshaped the English court in her image, elevating her family to unprecedented heights and becoming the first queen in English history, crowned with the sacred oil usually reserved for kings. Her influence was vast. Foreign ambassadors sought her favor. Courtiers reshuffled alliances to be in her good graces. The once obedient Henry began moving England officially away from Rome, creating the Church of England with himself at its head. Also, that Anne's crown could not be questioned. Yet even in her triumph, dark clouds gathered. Friends whispered behind their hands. Rivals circled, waiting, and Henry, fickle and restless, was already beginning to look beyond the brilliant woman who had rewritten the kingdom for him, and had won the throne. But keeping it would demand more than charm, ambition, or even love. And Boleyn had climbed higher than almost any woman of her time. But the higher you rise, the harder the fall. Almost from the moment she placed the crown on her head, the cracks in her world began to show. At the heart of Anne's struggles was the pressure to produce a male heir. Her first child, Elizabeth, though bright and healthy, was not the son Henry the Faith had hung his dynastic hopes upon. The clock was ticking, and suffered multiple pregnancies in quick succession, but heartbreak followed miscarriages that left her physically weakened and emotionally battered. Each lost child chipped away at the foundation she had built. Henry, once passionately devoted, began to pull away, his disappointment carving rifts between them. Never one to suffer in silence, argued, demanded, fought to keep her place. But Henry, a man who prized obedience as much as beauty, grew tired of her sharpness, her defiance, the very fire that had once drawn him in. Outside the royal chambers, enemies were gathering like wolves. Many nobles who had tolerated his rise with gritted teeth now openly schemed for her downfall. Catherine of Aragon's supporters never forgave for what they saw as theft and sacrilege. Even commoners whispered against her, calling her the great whore, blaming her for the schism with Rome and the heavy-handed changes that followed. And then came Jane Seymour. Quiet, demure, everything and was not. Jane captured Henry's wandering attention just as Anne's influence began to wane. Where Anne had dazzled him with brilliance and challenge, Jane offered soothing compliance. It was a dangerous shift, and Anne, perceptive as ever, saw it happening. She tried to reclaim her position, lavishing attention on Henry, promising more sons, begging for patience. But the king, ever fickle, had already begun imagining life without the woman for whom he had once torn a kingdom apart. Anne's political enemies, including Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, sensed the changing tide. They began laying the groundwork for a campaign of destruction, quietly gathering accusations, rumors, and witnesses. The woman who had played the dangerous game of ambition so masterfully was now losing ground, and had won her crown through cunning and courage, but in the brutal, shifting world of Henry's court, past victories meant little. Only fresh success mattered, and his enemies were sharpening their knives. The queen who had shattered a kingdom would soon see how quickly a kingdom could shatter her. And Boleyn's enemies didn't attack her with armies or swords. They came with whispers, secrets, and carefully sharpened lies. In the back rooms of court, betrayal was brewing. Silent, patient, deadly. Thomas Cromwell, once's greatest ally in the English Reformation, had turned against her. Their alliance had been built on mutual ambition, but now their interests clashed, and wanted reforms to help the poor and limit the power of greedy nobles. Cromwell wanted stability, favor with Henry, and no interference. Anne's boldness had made her dangerous, and in Henry's fickle heart, love had curdled into irritation, suspicion, and cold attachment. Anne had few true friends left. Even her charm, once her greatest weapon, now grated against the court's hunger for a gentler, more pliable queen. And Jane Seymour, quiet and calculating, waited just out of sight, the perfect contrast to Anne's fading fire. It was Cromwell who moved first. Knowing Henry was restless, knowing that the king wanted an exit but lacked a convenient excuse, Cromwell offered a solution. What if Anne could be removed? Not by divorce, which would humiliate Henry, but by disgrace. The accusations were wild, monstrous, even adultery, incest, conspiracy against the king. And the proud, brilliant queen, painted as a betrayer, a temptress, a threat to the very crown she once redefined. Cromwell carefully gathered evidence, coaxing confessions under torture, twisting courtly flirtations into damning testimony. Several men, including his own brother, George Boleyn, were arrested. The charges made little sense. They were riddled with contradictions and impossibilities. But in Henry's court, truth was whatever the king needed it to be. And sensing the tightening noose, fought desperately. She appealed to Henry's memory, to the love they had once shared. But it was no use. The man who had once torn England apart for her now refused to meet her eyes. On May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. As the great gates slammed shut behind her, she knew the truth. She was no longer a queen. She was a prisoner, a pawn trapped in the brutal game she had once played so masterfully. Betrayal had sealed her fate, and now, alone in the tower, Anne Boleyn waited for the final move. Anne Boleyn stood in the great hall of the Tower of London, facing a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their very titles and fortunes to her rise. Now they sat in judgment, cold and watchful, prepared to erase the woman who had once changed the destiny of England. The charges against her were shocking. Adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. High treason. Conspiracy against the king. In another world, such accusations against a queen would have been unthinkable. But here, now they were simply theater. A grim performance designed to give Henry VIII exactly what he wanted. Anne's downfall wrapped in a thin veil of legality, and defended herself with the same fire that had once won Henry's heart. She denied every accusation with intelligence, precision, and an unwavering composure that astonished even her enemies. She reminded them that she had been crowned with sacred oil, chosen by God, and anointed as Queen of England. She reminded them of her loyalty, her sacrifices, her love. But it was all for nothing. The verdict had been decided long before and set foot in the courtroom. The trial was a spectacle for the court and for the people, a public unmaking of a once unbreakable woman. Witness after witness, many coerced or bribed spoke damning words. Dates and places contradicted each other. Evidence was flimsy when it existed at all. But the truth was irrelevant. Now Anne was found guilty. Her brother George and the other men accused with her were sentenced to death as well, and will be executed by beheading, a merciful sentence compared to the usual traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering. When the verdict was read, Anne did not break. She stood tall, her face pale, but her spirit fiercely intact. In those final moments before being led back to her cell, she spoke clearly, declaring that she was prepared to die, and prayed that God would have mercy on her soul. As the heavy doors of the hall closed behind her, the court exhaled in relief. The storm, and had been brilliant, dangerous, unforgettable, was nearly over. But even then, they did not understand. They were not erasing Anne Boleyn. They were immortalizing her in betrayal, in tragedy, and in legend. After her trial, Anne Boleyn was returned to the Tower of London, not as the triumphant queen who had once commanded England, but as a condemned prisoner awaiting death, yet even facing the end, and refused to crumble. In the cold, echoing halls of the tower, and prepared herself. She spent hours in prayer, kneeling on the hard stone floors, her hands clasped tightly, her voice steady. She confessed to no crimes because she believed she had committed none. She was not afraid to die, she said, but she prayed that her death would bring peace to the kingdom, and perhaps mercy to her little daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting, those few who had stayed loyal, wept in private, and comforted them instead of the other way around. She joked bitterly at times that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head. In her dark humor was the stubborn spark that had made her unforgettable. Henry VIII, meanwhile, showed no sign of mercy. He had already turned his attention to Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution date was finalized, Henry was arranging his next marriage. For Anne, this final betrayal from the man who had once torn down a kingdom for her must have been the deepest cut. On May 18, 1536, Anne was told she would die the next morning. She slept little that night. Instead, she spent her final hours in prayer, asking God for forgiveness for all who had wronged her, and perhaps for herself, for the ambition and pride that had led her here. Henry, with a flicker of royal kindness, had arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution. Faster, cleaner, less brutal than an axe. It was a small mercy, bought perhaps more for the king's conscience than for Anne's comfort. At dawn, and dressed carefully for her final moment. A dark gray gown of damask trimmed with fur, a crimson kirtle beneath colors of dignity, of sacrifice. She pinned up her dark hair and tucked it beneath a simple cap, ready to face the blade with grace. As the tower's cold morning mist curled around the courtyard stones, and Boleyn, queen, mother, survivor, fighter, stepped forward, there would be no tears, no pleas. Only a final act of courage in the face of history's judgment. Her end was near, but her story was just beginning. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold built within the Tower of London's walls. A small crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, all wrapped in silence, as if even the stone walls held their breath, and stood tall. Her gray gown fluttered slightly in the cold morning breeze. She looked thinner than she had at court, her face pale but calm. There were no hysterics, no broken sobs. If anything, she faced death with the same fierce dignity that had once shaken a kingdom to its knees. She spoke briefly, carefully choosing her final words. She did not accuse. She did not defend herself. She prayed for the king's health and prosperity, the very man who had abandoned her. In those final moments, and offered the world not a confession, but forgiveness. Her courage stunned even those who had come to see her fall. The French executioner, brought specially to ensure a swift death, stepped forward, and knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer, her eyes lifted toward the heavens. A small white cloth was tied around her eyes. She remained still. The sword flashed once silent, swift, and Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, history maker, was no more. She was buried quickly in an unmarked grave within the tower grounds, laid to rest in a narrow chest because no proper coffin had been prepared for her. The queen, once crowned in gold, now left to vanish without ceremony. Yet Anne's story didn't end in that cold grave, her daughter. Elizabeth, the child whose birth had once disappointed a king, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose reign would see the flowering of English art, power, and global influence. A queen who inherited her mother's fierce spirit, sharp mind, and unyielding resilience. And Boleyn changed the course of England forever. Her ambition helped trigger the break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. Her fall showed the world that even queens could be cast aside. Yet through her blood, through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy blazed brighter than any crown she had worn in life. In the end, Anne Boleyn won a kind of immortality, not through her survival, but through her indelible impact on history. By the early 1770s, The American colonies simmered like a pot left too long over a roaring fire. The relationship with Britain, once seen as a proud mother country, had soured into resentment, suspicion, and growing fury. It hadn't started with tea. Years earlier, the Stamp Act had enraged colonists by placing taxes on everything from newspapers to playing cards. That was followed by the Townshend Acts, taxing essentials like paper, glass, and paint. Each new law, passed thousands of miles away by a parliament in which the colonists had no representation, was like another spark landing in dry brush. At first, the anger showed itself in polite petitions and fiery pamphlets. Colonial assemblies drafted formal protests. Merchants organized boycotts. Writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson filled newspapers with passionate arguments about liberty and rights. But as time wore on, frustration deepened into something darker, a slow realization that Britain wasn't listening. Worse, Britain didn't care. Many colonists clung to the hope that if they just made enough noise, if they just reasoned hard enough, Parliament would repeal the taxes. And sometimes they did. The Stamp Act was famously repealed after a loud colonial protest. But every small victory was followed by new legislation, new taxes, new insults. It wasn't about the money. It never really was. The taxes themselves were modest by British standards. What infuriated the colonists was the principle. They were being taxed without consent, treated as subjects rather than citizens, ruled like distant possessions rather than partners. Boston, more than any other city, became the beating heart of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive, fiery group of patriots, grew louder and bolder. In 1770, tensions exploded into violence when British soldiers fired on unarmed civilians in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Blood had already stained the cobblestones. Trust was a thing of the past. By 1773, the colonies were teetering on the edge. A final insult would tip them into open defiance. And it came not in the form of soldiers or new laws or armies, but a quiet, seemingly harmless shape of crates stacked with tea. The colonists didn't know it yet, but the night the tea floated in the cold waters of Boston Harbor, the world would change forever. In 1773, Parliament made a critical miscalculation. Believing the American colonies would quietly accept cheaper tea, they passed the Tea Act, a law that was supposed to save the struggling British East India Company and, incidentally, reassert Britain's right to tax the colonies. On paper, it looked like a good deal. The Tea Act allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out the middlemen, slashing prices, and offering a luxury product at a bargain. A few pennies cheaper. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Because the problem wasn't the price of tea, it was the principle behind it. The Tea Act left the hated tax on tea firmly in place. Accepting the tea, even at a discount, would mean acknowledging Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. To many Americans, that was unthinkable, a surrender of the liberties they had fought to protect for more than a decade. The news of the Tea Act spread like wildfire through the colonies. Merchants fumed. They saw their livelihoods threatened by a monopoly that would crush local trade. Patriots raged at the hidden message. The Crown still believed it could do whatever it pleased. In Boston, the reaction was especially fierce. Already a city scarred by the Boston Massacre and years of economic hardship, Bostonians recognized the Tea Act for what it was, a trap disguised as a bargain. Refusing the tea became a matter of honor, a litmus test for loyalty to the cause of liberty. Public meetings swelled. Newspaper columns burned with fiery rhetoric. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and others, organized boycotts, vowing that no East India Company tea would be unloaded, sold, or drunk on American soil. All across the colonies, ships carrying the controversial tea were turned away by local resistance. In ports from New York to Charleston, the message was clear. We will not be bought. But in Boston, fate twisted differently. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived, anchored in the harbor, and sat there, refusing to leave. Royal officials insisted the tea be unloaded. The colonists refused. A deadlock grew, taut as a drawn bowstring. The tension was unbearable. A single act would break it, and history would never be the same again. As the British tea ships sat stubbornly anchored in Boston Harbor, The city itself transformed into a powder keg. Every day that passed without resolution tightened the tension. Boston wasn't just resisting, it was preparing for a fight. In taverns, churches, and public squares, angry colonists debated what to do. The Sons of Liberty, led by fiery voices like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, moved swiftly to organize resistance. They posted public notices calling on citizens to boycott British tea and held raucous meetings that swelled with farmers, artisans, and merchants alike. Each gathering added fuel to the fire. The Old South Meeting House became the nerve center of the resistance. Thousands crammed into the wooden hall, their breath fogging the air, their voices rising in defiance. Here, resolutions were passed. Speeches were made and tempers boiled. Each vote against the unloading of tea was another hammer blow against British authority. But while the people of Boston stood united, the clock was ticking. British law demanded that imported goods like tea be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days. If the ships remained after the deadline, customs officials would seize the cargo and the tax would be collected by force. The Sons of Liberty understood that once the tax was paid, even under protest, the principle would be lost. It wasn't just about the tea anymore. It was about whether the colonies would accept being treated as subjects without rights, or whether they would stand and fight for their future. Meanwhile, the royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, dug in his heels. He refused to let the tea ships leave without unloading their cargo, demanding that the law be obeyed. Colonial outrage be damned. To him, backing down meant admitting that mobs, not monarchs, ruled the colonies. Boston's standoff became a spectacle. Every man, woman, and child knew that something was coming. You could feel it in the air, that cold, sharp sense before a storm when the world held its breath. All it would take was one spark to ignite an explosion, and somewhere among the crowded streets and crowded hearts of Boston, the decision was quietly taking shape, a plan that would echo across oceans and empires. December 16, 1773, dawned gray and cold over Boston, a city balanced on the edge of history. For nearly 3 weeks, the tea ships had sat in the harbor like ticking bombs. Now the final deadline has arrived. According to British law, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival. If it wasn't, customs officials could seize the cargo, and British troops could be called in to enforce the law. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew what was at stake. If the tea came ashore, the principle was lost. If the colonists allowed it, even once their cause, their claim to rights and liberty, would unravel. That morning, thousands of Bostonians and nearby colonists packed into the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in town. Some had walked miles through the icy countryside to be there. The meeting was so packed that men spilled out into the streets, straining to hear the fiery speeches echoing through the halls. Samuel Adams, the iron voice of rebellion, presided over the gathering. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce the Tea Act, to cry out against tyranny, to urge immediate action. But even among the defiance, uncertainty hung heavy. What could be done without sparking outright war? How could they stop the tea without opening the floodgates to brutal retaliation? As the afternoon wore on, riders galloped in with grim news. Governor Thomas Hutchinson remained unmoved. The ships would not be allowed to leave without unloading. The tea would be seized, the tax collected, and the king's law enforced. The crowd buzzed with fury. The walls of the meeting house seemed to shudder with the force of it. Yet Samuel Adams stood calmly and spoke the words that signaled the end of debate. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. A simple sentence, but everyone knew what it meant. There would be no more petitions, no more compromises. Action would be taken. Outside, a war whoop cut through the gathering gloom, the signal. Men disguised themselves quickly, smearing soot in their faces, donning blankets and feathers in crude imitation of Mohawk warriors. It wasn't about fooling anyone. It was about creating a symbol, a message no one could mistake. The deadline had passed. Boston would answer not with words, but with defiance. As twilight deepened over Boston on December 16, 1773, the quiet streets began to stir. Figures moved through the shadows, ordinary men cloaked in rough blankets, their faces blackened with soot. some adorned with feathers. They weren't trying to fool anyone into believing they were real Mohawks. Their disguise was symbolic, an act of shedding their old identities, of taking a stand as something new, something fierce. By the dozens, they made their way to Griffin's Wharf, where the 3T ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay anchored. The harbor water churned cold and dark beneath them, thick with the sharp bite of winter air. There was no shouting, no drunken chaos. This was not a riot. It was a mission carried out with calm, ruthless precision. Armed with hatchets and clubs, the disguised colonists swarmed the ships, overwhelming the few crew members still aboard. No harm came to the sailors. They were pushed aside, watched in silence as the operation began. Men split open the wooden chests with practiced blows, the fragrant smell of fresh tea spilling into the cold night air. Others heaved the crates overboard, their heavy splashes echoing across the still waters of the harbor. Chest after chest, 342 in total, was broken and dumped until the black water swirled with thousands of pounds of tea leaves. Spectators watched from the wharf, silent, awed. British guards stationed nearby made no move to intervene. Whether from confusion, sympathy, or fear of escalating violence remains unclear. Some accounts suggest that even among British loyalists, there was an understanding. Something had shifted, and there would be no stopping it tonight. The discipline was extraordinary. No cargo was stolen. No one raided the ships for valuables. Only the tea, the hated symbol of British oppression, was targeted. In a town where hunger and hardship were daily realities, the men could have easily turned the protest into an excuse for looting. They did not. When it was over, the harbor resembled a great swirling cauldron filled with torn chests and soaking tea leaves. The smell of the sea mixed with the sharp tang of smashed tea, filling the night air with a strange, bittersweet scent. The work was done. Silently, the men disappeared into the night, vanishing into the alleys and back streets of Boston. They left behind no names, no leaders, no claims to fame, only the unmistakable mark of revolution. As the last broken crates bobbed in the dark water, Boston stood still, almost holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a riot, a brawl, or a drunken spectacle. It was something far rarer, an act of cold, deliberate defiance carried out under the cloak of night. The harbor was transformed into a giant, swirling teapot. Thousands of pounds of East India Company tea floated in great mats on the water, staining it black. Some colonists, curious and rebellious, scooped handfuls of soaked leaves from the harbor, only to be chastised by the Sons of Liberty patrolling the docks. Nothing was to be salvaged. No one would profit from this night's work. This was principle, pure and simple. The town woke the next morning to the smell of salty tea hanging heavy in the air. News spread like wildfire, word of mouth, letters, broadsheets by midday. Everyone from apprentices to merchants knew what had happened, and opinions split fast. Among patriots, there was pride, a fierce, swelling pride that ordinary men had stood up to the mightiest empire in the world and struck a blow for liberty. Among loyalists and moderates, there was horror. To them, the destruction of property was reckless, dangerous. Had the colonies crossed a line they couldn't walk back from? Governor Thomas Hutchinson raged in his mansion, furious not only at the destruction, but at the message it sent. If the king's authority could be defied so brazenly in Boston, where else might rebellion spark? British officials were stunned. They had expected protests, boycotts, maybe another riot like those that had broken out over the Stamp Act. They hadn't expected organized, disciplined revolutionaries to calmly destroy tens of thousands of pounds of royal property without so much as breaking a window. The ship's captains, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver, could only watch helplessly as their cargo disappeared beneath the waves. In the official ledgers, the night's loss will be tallied at over 10,000 British pounds, a fortune. But the real loss wasn't measured in pounds sterling or ruined tea. It was measured in trust, in loyalty, in the fragile illusion that Britain still ruled her colonies with consent. The night the tea sank, something deeper rose to the surface, a shared, undeniable truth. The age of peaceful protest was ending. A reckoning was coming, and Boston was ready when word of the Boston Tea Party crossed the Atlantic and reached London. The reaction was swift and furious to British officials. It was not simply a protest. It was rebellion, an open, mocking challenge to royal authority that could not be ignored. King George III, upon hearing the news, was said to have grown cold with anger. Parliament, already frustrated by years of colonial disobedience, exploded in outrage. They demanded punishment, not just for the city of Boston, but as a warning to all the American colonies. The result was a series of laws so harsh they were quickly nicknamed the Intolerable Acts in America. The first blow came swiftly, the Boston Port Act. In one brutal stroke, Parliament ordered the closure of Boston's bustling harbor, the economic lifeline of the city, until the destroyed tea was paid for and order restored. Ships could no longer enter or leave. Trade vanished. Goods and supplies dried up. Boston, once vibrant and noisy, grew quiet, its docks eerily still. But the punishment didn't stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the colony of its self-governing rights, placing it firmly under the king's appointed officials. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried back in Britain, a clear message that British authorities were untouchable. And to make sure the colony's new force was an option, British soldiers were quartered throughout Boston, living among the very citizens they were meant to subdue. The message was clear. Rebellion would be crushed. Liberty was a luxury the crown would no longer tolerate. But Parliament's heavy hand had an unintended effect. Instead of frightening the other colonies into submission, it outraged them. News of Boston suffering when its port closed, its people starving under martial law, stirred deep sympathy and righteous anger throughout America. Wagon loads of food and supplies poured into Boston from neighboring colonies. Letters of support, pledges of unity, and secret meetings began to weave the once fragmented colonies closer together. What had once been a Massachusetts problem was rapidly becoming an American one. In punishing Boston, Britain had hoped to make an example of them. Instead, they made Boston a symbol, a rallying cry for resistance. The flames of revolution, once flickering in isolated pockets, now began to blaze from colony to colony, and there would be no easy extinguishing of them. The punishment of Boston sent shockwaves far beyond the rocky shores of Massachusetts. Across the 13 colonies, outrage turned into something far more dangerous for Britain: unity. For years, the colonies had acted like distant cousins, bickering and competing, separated by geography, religion, and trade rivalries. But when Parliament slammed Boston's harbor shut and stripped Massachusetts of its self-governance, Americans across the continent realized if it could happen to Boston, it could happen to anyone. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, South Carolina to New Hampshire, the response was swift. Colonists sent wagons full of food, supplies, and letters of solidarity to the suffering people of Boston. Town meetings buzzed with anger. Newspaper printers worked day and night to spread the news. The fight was no longer Boston's alone. It was everyone's. And so, in September 1774, something unprecedented happened. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. For the first time, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered under one roof to discuss a unified response. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, once merely regional figures, now stood together as architects of a movement that was growing larger by the day. Their goal, at least officially, was not yet full independence. Most still hoped for reconciliation, for a return to the old relationship of mutual respect under the British Crown. But beneath the polite debates and carefully worded petitions, a deeper understanding was taking root. The colonies could no longer afford to stand separately. At the Congress, they agreed to a sweeping boycott of British goods. They pledged mutual support in the face of further British aggression, and they made it clear any attack on one colony would be considered an attack on all in taverns and meeting houses across the continent. Ordinary people began using words that had once been whispered only in private: unity, resistance, liberty. In bringing the hammer down on Boston, Britain had imagined it would crush rebellion. Instead, it had welded the colonies together into something far more dangerous: a people who, despite their differences, were beginning to think of themselves not as scattered provinces, but as Americans. The winds of revolution were no longer just stirring. They were gathering into a storm, and it was too late for Britain to stop it. The night the tea sank into Boston Harbor, it wasn't just crates that were destroyed. It was the illusion that the American colonies could remain loyal subjects forever. The Boston Tea Party lit a spark that no king, no army, no distant parliament could ever snuff out. In the months that followed, that spark caught fire across the colonies. What had once been protests, boycotts, and polite petitions hardened into open resistance. Town militias began drilling openly, storehouses filled with powder and shot. Men who had once toasted King George III in taverns now whispered about revolution under the same roofs. Boston became a symbol of sacrifice, battered but unbowed. The more Britain tried to tighten its grip, the more the colonies slipped through its fingers. Every ship that sailed past the closed, silent harbor of Boston was a silent reminder that tyranny had met its match in American defiance. When Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts, they intended to make an example out of Boston to scare the other colonies into submission. Instead, they had created a martyr city, a rallying cry. From Georgia to New Hampshire, colonists realized that their fates were tied together. Resistance was no longer about tea. It was about survival, identity, freedom. By the spring of 1775, the tension reached a boiling point outside Boston in the villages of Lexington and Concord. British troops, sent to confiscate colonial weapons, instead found armed farmers, ordinary men ready to defend their rights with musket fire. The first shots of the American Revolution rang out. A direct line traced back to the moment when men chose principle over profit and dumped a fortune's worth of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party showed the world that revolution doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and banners. Sometimes it starts quietly, with a small group of determined people standing in the cold, choosing defiance over fear. In dumping the tea, the colonists weren't just rejecting a tax, they were rejecting an empire. And though the road ahead would be bloody, bitter, and uncertain, one thing had become clear that night in Boston Harbor. The American colonies were no longer loyal subjects. They were something new, something dangerous. They were revolutionaries, and they were just getting started all before the towering pyramids of Giza, before Mesopotamian cities buzzed with life, before Stonehenge stood against the sky. There was a corral hidden away in the dry valleys of coastal Peru. Corral rose in silent majesty nearly 5,000 years ago, then faded into near complete oblivion, swallowed by sands and forgotten by history. For centuries, the world did not even know it existed. The Super Valley, where Corral once thrived, seems at first glance an unlikely place for civilization to bloom. The landscape is parched, barren. The river is little more than a thin silver thread winding through rocks and dust. To most eyes, it looked inhospitable, a place abandoned by life. Yet it was here, amid the desolation, that one of humanity's earliest great cities took shape. Corral wasn't just a collection of scattered huts or a temporary trading post. It was a planned city, sprawling over 150 acres, filled with pyramids, plazas, and residential quarters, and ceremonial spaces. It had scale, purpose, and vision, a complex society blossoming centuries before the Egyptians began stacking stones into pyramids of their own. The people of Cairo achieved this without the wheel, without written language, without metal tools. They built massive structures from stone and earth with nothing but ingenuity, communal effort, and the raw power of human will. Yet for thousands of years, Corral's existence remained a secret. Even when travelers stumbled across the strange weathered mounds scattered across the valley, they mistook them for natural formations, mere hills sculpted by the desert winds. No one imagined that beneath the sand lay one of the oldest cities in the world, predating even the civilizations that history books had crowned as the firsts. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologists, led by Ruth Shady, uncovered the truth. What they found, buried in the dust of time, would rewrite the story of the Americas and force the world to reconsider what it thought it knew about the birth of civilization itself. Corral had risen, flourished, and fallen in total anonymity. Now, after millennia of silence, its stones are speaking again, whispering of a peaceful, intelligent people who built a world of complexity and wonder, in a land where life itself seemed impossible, and this was only the beginning of their story. At first glance, the Supi Valley looks like a place where life should struggle to exist. Harsh winds sweep across endless stretches of sand and stone. The sun beats down mercilessly, drying out the earth, baking the landscape into cracked, brittle sheets. Water is scarce, the river a meandering thread, fighting for survival to the untrained eye. It is a wasteland, barren, empty, forgotten by the gods. But the people of Carol saw something different. They did not see a desert to be feared. They saw a canvas to be shaped. They recognized the river, however modest, as the lifeblood of possibility. And so, with patience, ingenuity, and sheer determination, they turned this unforgiving place into a thriving oasis of life and culture. Their first victory was agriculture. They learned to tame the river's seasonal floods, building simple but brilliant irrigation systems that channeled water across the valley floor. Where others saw sand and dust, they coaxed green shoots of hope. Cotton, beans, squash, guava, sweet potatoes. Cotton, in particular, became their treasure. It was spun into fishing nets and textiles, fueling trade with coastal villages, and creating bonds that stretched far beyond their desert home. But growing crops was only part of their mastery. The people of Corral understood that survival in the desert required balance. They worked with nature, not against it. They built their homes and plazas from stone and earth, designed to withstand both scorching heat and the rare, punishing rains that occasionally swept through the valley. They studied the stars and seasons, planning their harvests with the precision of master astronomers. Trade became the veins and arteries of Corral's economy. Dried fish, cotton, fruits, and handmade goods flowed up and down the coast. In exchange, Corral received exotic goods, colorful shells from the Pacific, rare stones from the Andes, ideas from distant peoples. They were not isolated. They were connected in a land where survival seemed impossible. Corral thrived through intelligence, innovation, and community. They didn't conquer the desert with brute force. They partnered with it, learning its rhythms, respecting its power, building a society that was not just functional. It was extraordinary. Against the odds, Corral blossomed into a beacon of civilization, and it was only beginning to rise, rising out of the desert like ancient guardians. The pyramids of Corral defy everything we thought we knew about early civilization in the Americas. These are not small, crude structures built by primitive hands. They were massive, deliberate works of architecture created by a people with vision, organization, and ambition. The centerpiece of the city was the Pyramid Mare, the largest of Corral's monumental structures. It stretched more than 450 feet in length and towered nearly 60 feet above the desert floor, a feat of engineering on par with the early wonders of the ancient world. Built from stone, mud, and woven reed bags filled with rocks, the pyramid was designed not just to endure the harsh climate, but to withstand the punishing earthquakes that occasionally rattled the region and endure it, standing silent against wind and time for nearly 5 millennia. But the pyramids of Carol were not tombs. Unlike the massive burial complexes of Egypt, Carol's pyramids served a different purpose. They were centers of ceremony, power, and public life. Temples and gathering spaces crowned their summits, accessible by broad, elegant staircases. Fires once burned atop these platforms, and rituals were held beneath the endless Peruvian sky. At the foot of the pyramids, vast plazas opened up, sunken and circular, inviting thousands to gather for religious ceremonies, political meetings, and communal celebrations. The very design of Corral's cityscape suggested a society that prized community and order, a people deeply connected to one another and to the cosmos. Around the pyramids, smaller residential complexes fanned out, likely home to priests, administrators, artisans, and farmers. The pyramids themselves seemed to have been strategically placed, aligned with celestial events, sunrises, solstices, the cycles of the stars. To the people of Kuril, architecture wasn't just practical, it was spiritual, mathematical, cosmic. Walking among the weathered stones today, it's almost impossible not to feel a strange sense of these structures were raised without metal tools, without the wheel, without beasts of burden. Yet they rose with symmetry, scale, and staggering precision. The Great Pyramids of Carol were not built for vanity, nor for war. They were built to connect earth and sky, community and cosmos, humanity and eternity, and they still whisper across the sands, telling a story that refuses to be forgotten. Among the ruins of Carol, there is something profoundly different, something that sets it apart from so many ancient civilizations. No weapons have been found buried beneath its sands. No defensive walls circle its plazas. No mass graves hint at bloody conquest or internal strife. Unlike the kingdoms that rose and fell through war, Cairo was a society built on peace. It's a revelation that defies expectations. Here was a civilization that flourished not through violence, but through cooperation, trade, and shared belief. The people of Cairo seem to have invested their energy not in armies or fortresses, but in architecture, astronomy, music, and communal life. Their plazas and pyramids weren't monuments to victory over enemies. They were centers of celebration, worship, and governance. This was a civilization that chose to gather rather than conquer, to negotiate rather than destroy. Trade was the lifeblood of Cairo's success. Cotton, grown along the fertile riverbanks, was spun into fishing nets that were traded with coastal communities. In return, Cairo received dried fish, an essential source of protein, and exotic goods from faraway places, colorful shells from the Pacific, precious stones from the highlands, and even rare tropical fruits from distant valleys. This wide network of trade stitched the region together, binding far-flung communities into a peaceful web of mutual benefit. And in the center of it all, Corral thrived as a cultural and economic hub. Religious and ceremonial life played a vital role in maintaining social harmony. The city's grand public spaces and sunken plazas likely served as stages for rituals that united the people under shared spiritual beliefs. Music filled these gatherings, flutes carved from condor bones, drums made from deer hides, creating soundscapes that echoed across the desert, tying individual lives to something greater. Leadership, too, appeared to rely less on military strength and more on spiritual authority and civic organization. The city's leaders must have coordinated massive construction projects, seasonal agricultural cycles, and complex trade agreements, all without leaving behind the brutal scars of war. In an ancient world so often defined by conflict, Corral stands as a shining exception, a reminder that civilization does not have to rise on the broken backs of the conquered. It can instead be built by the quiet power of collaboration, creativity, and trust. At Corral, the stones still seem to hum with echoes of a world long gone. It was not just a city of buildings and trade. It was a city alive with sound, ceremony, and spiritual rhythm. Music and ritual were woven into the very heartbeat of Corral civilization. Archaeologists, digging carefully through the dry sands, uncovered a treasure trove of ancient instruments, flutes crafted from the bones of condors and pelicans, whistles fashioned from deer antlers, small drums stretched with animal hides. These artifacts were not simple toys. They were crafted with care, tuned to specific notes, designed to carry sound across the wide-open plazas of the city. In a world without written language, music spoke the language of the soul. Imagine it. The low thrum of drums rising at dusk, flutes keening like the desert wind, feet stamping on the sunken plazas as hundreds gathered under the fading light. Fires would crackle atop the pyramid platforms. Priests dressed in intricate woven garments would chant to the gods of the river, the earth, the stars. In those moments, Corral was not just a city, it was a symphony. The layout of Corral itself suggests that ritual life was at its core. The grand plazas were not mere open spaces. They were stages for communal ceremonies, carefully designed to draw people together. The sunken circular courts acted like ancient amphitheaters, focusing sound and sight onto the rituals performed at their centers. And above them all, the pyramids loomed not as tombs, but as sacred mountains built by human hands, linking the earth to the heavens. Rituals likely marked the turning of the seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest, the movements of the stars. Music was not just entertainment. It was a bridge between people, between nature and the divine, between the known and the mysteries beyond. No violent murals, no terrifying gods of war, no bloodthirsty sacrifices. In Cairo, the spiritual world seems to have been one of harmony, celebration, and reverence, even today. When the desert wind whistles through the ruins, you can almost hear it. The faint strains of ancient music, the forgotten songs of a people who found beauty, meaning, and connection in the heart of the harsh, endless sands. Cairo wasn't just a place of music, trade, and ritual. It was a marvel of engineering, a testament to human ingenuity in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals, the people of Kerala shaped a city of stone and earth that has endured nearly 5,000 years. Their achievements were astonishing. Massive pyramids rose from the desert floor, constructed not with small, fragile bricks, but with enormous stones carried across the dry valley. Workers transported rocks using reed bags, ingenious baskets strong enough to bear heavy loads, woven from the very plants that grew along the riverbanks. Layer upon layer, they built with care, stacking stone and filling the interiors with rubble to create structures that could withstand not only time, but nature's fury. And they understood nature well. Kerala lies in a region prone to violent earthquakes. Their pyramids and plazas survived largely intact. How? By mastering earthquake-resistant architecture. Builders used flexible construction techniques, layered fills, wide foundations, and rounded corners that allowed their monuments to absorb and dissipate seismic energy. It was engineering born not from textbooks, but from an intimate knowledge of the earth itself. Water management was another silent triumph. Despite living in a desert, the people of Kerala developed sophisticated irrigation systems. Channels and canals carefully guided river water to their agricultural fields, allowing crops to flourish even during dry seasons. No water was wasted. Every drop mattered. The layout of the Kerala itself reflected brilliant urban planning. Major structures aligned with key astronomical points, suggesting a deep understanding of the solar cycles. The sunken plazas, with their precise geometry, were more than gathering places. They were instruments for tracking the heavens, allowing priests and astronomers to predict seasons crucial for survival. Even the city's organization spoke of a complex society. Residential zones, administrative areas, ceremonial centers, all were arranged in harmony, balancing communal life with sacred spaces. They built not just for the moment, but for generations. Today, as modern engineers marvel at Kerala's resilience, they are reminded that greatness is not measured by technology alone. Sometimes the deepest wisdom lies in understanding the forces of nature, in working with the land, not against it. Coral stones have endured storms, quakes, and the erosion of time itself. They stand as a silent testament to a civilization that engineered their dreams into the desert sands. For centuries, the city of Coral flourished, a beacon of peace, music, trade, and architectural mastery in the desert sands. And then, quietly, almost without a trace, it was abandoned. No fires marked its fall. No signs of conquest scar its walls. No mass graves or shattered monuments tell a story of sudden disaster. Instead, the Kerala simply faded, its plazas emptied, its pyramids left to the drifting sands, its flutes and drums silenced by time. Why did they leave? That question still lingers like a ghost across the Super Valley. Some scholars believe that environmental change struck the final blow. Evidence suggests that a long period of drought may have crippled Kerala's agriculture. Without the river's life-giving waters, the fields would have withered. Trade networks dependent on surplus cotton and food would have faltered. The careful balance Kerala had maintained with its harsh environment may have finally tipped beyond repair. Other theories point to shifting trade routes. As neighboring cultures grew and new centers of power emerged along the coast and inland, Kerala's influence might have diminished. Perhaps the goods they once supplied, cotton, fish, produce, were no longer enough to sustain their role as a dominant city. Slowly, the lifeblood of commerce drained away. Still others whisper of internal decline. Without written records, we can only imagine political struggles, religious upheaval, or simple exhaustion after centuries of growth. Even peaceful societies can fracture under pressure when survival becomes uncertain. Whatever the cause, the departure seems to have been gradual, not sudden. Families likely drifted away one by one, seeking more fertile valleys, stronger rivers, and new beginnings. Children who once ran across Kerala's plazas grew up telling stories of a lost city behind them, stories that would eventually fade into legend. The desert reclaimed what humans had built. Winds carried fine sand over stone temples. Flutes lay buried beneath shifting dunes. What had once been a humming, vibrant civilization became a field of silent, sleeping mounts. For nearly 4,000 years, the Kerala remained hidden, a whisper beneath the sands waiting. Today, as archaeologists carefully uncover its stones, the question still burns. How does a city so advanced, so beautifully crafted, simply vanish? Perhaps the truth is that even the greatest civilizations, no matter how wise or peaceful, are still fragile. Threads woven into the tapestry of time, forever vulnerable to the unseen forces of change for millennia. Corral lay forgotten, buried beneath the silent sands of the Super Valley. Travelers passed the strange rounded hills that dotted the landscape, never suspecting that beneath their feet lay the ruins of a civilization older than the pyramids of Egypt. To them, these were just natural formations, mounds shaped by the wind and time. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the world would finally hear Corral's voice again in the 1990s. Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Supe Valley, driven by curiosity and a growing sense that these hills might hold secrets no one had yet uncovered. What they found would rewrite the story of human civilization in the Americas. Layer by painstaking layer, the sand was brushed away. Beneath it emerged walls of carefully cut stone, grand staircases, sunken plazas, pyramids. A city far older than anyone could have imagined. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the unbelievable. Corral was over 4,600 years old, thriving at the same time as the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It was a discovery that shook the foundations of archaeology. Before Corral, scholars believed that civilization in the Americas developed much later, shadowed by the great empires of the Old World. Corral changed everything. It proved that the Americas had birthed monumental architecture, complex urban life, and social organization independently, long before the rise of the Incas or the Maya. Ruth Shady and her team found not just stone and rubble, but the remnants of life, musical instruments, fishing nets, textiles, quipu, ancient knot records, and even offerings made to the gods. Each artifact told a story of a people who had built a society with vision, intelligence, and profound creativity. Corral's rediscovery was more than an academic triumph. It was a resurrection. A civilization that had slept beneath the desert for thousands of years now stood revealed under the open sky once more. Its plazas kissed by the same winds that had once carried the sounds of flutes and the laughter of children. Today, Corral is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a fragile, priceless link to humanity's earliest dreams of building, belonging, and believing. The sands had hidden Corral well, but in the end, the stones endured, waiting for someone to listen, to see, to remember. Carol stands today as a silent giant, a reminder that civilization's roots stretch far deeper than we once believed. Among its pyramids and plazas, the ancient stones whisper a story that reshapes our understanding of humanity's journey. The story is not of conquest and bloodshed, but of harmony, ingenuity, and hope. Long before the towering empires of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt, the people of Kuro were building something extraordinary. They raised pyramids without the wheel. They mapped the stars without written records. They created a thriving society, rooted in trade, music, ritual, and engineering, all without leaving scars of war upon the land. In an era often defined by conflict, Corral offers another vision of what civilization can be, a society that valued connection over conquest, knowledge over domination. It reminds us that complexity does not require violence, that greatness is not measured by how many armies march across a battlefield, but by how a community comes together to build, to create, to dream. Carol's legacy reaches far beyond the dry sands of the Supe Valley. It challenges old assumptions that civilization had a single cradle, that urban life and monumental architecture belonged first to the Old World. Carol proves that humanity's spirit of innovation and aspiration arose independently in many corners of the earth, shaped by different hands, but driven by the same eternal desires to endure, to celebrate, to reach toward the divine. Today, walking among the Corral's weathered ruins, you can almost hear it. The pulse of drums, the low hum of flutes, the murmur of traders bargaining in the plazas, the laughter of children racing through stone alleys under a sky of endless stars. Their lives, their dreams, their stories are still with us, etched into the bones of the earth. Coral teaches us that even when civilizations fall, their spirit can endure, sleeping under sands, waiting to be remembered, waiting to inspire again. In the great timeline of human history, coral shines not just as a relic of the past, but as a beacon for the future, A reminder that even in the harshest deserts, even under the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can take root and build a world that reaches for the stars.